It's November 1983, and there is a group of teenagers who come in contact with another teenage girl their age who had escaped from a nearby lab. The lab performed tests on this teenager, such as mind control and things of the like. This teenager's mother had undergone testing that was similar to that of MK Ultra. The girl had abilities that were unlike anything the group of teenagers had ever seen. All of a sudden, they found themselves fighting for their lives, the lives of their loved ones, and people around them. They were not just fighting the government lab, but also beings and things from other dimensions. This is the beginning of the hit TV show Stranger Things, in case you've never watched it. What if I told you that some of the things within the series are references to actual conspiracy theories? The Duffer Brothers, who are the writers behind Stranger Things, have stated that some inspiration for the show had come from a conspiracy theory called the Montauk Project, and that the tests that were run on Eleven's mother were that of the actual CIA program called MK Ultra. The Montauk Project is a conspiracy theory, well, depending on who you ask, that claims the U.S. government conducted testing and development of psychological warfare techniques along with time travel. According to Preston Nichols, who I guess you can say was a whistleblower if all of this is in fact true, but in his book he talked about the government allegedly kidnapping children, especially those with psychic abilities, using electromagnetic frequencies to enhance telepathic powers, conducting time travel experiments through the Montauk Chair, opened portals to other dimensions, and encountered non-human entities, along with creating mind control programs that were so powerful they could erase memories or program assassins. All of this allegedly happened at Camp Hero, also known as Montauk Air Force Station in Montauk, New York. Let's put on our tinfoil hats and dive into the conspiracy theories behind Camp Hero, MK Ultra, the Philadelphia experiment, and the Montauk Project. And as Peter Moon said in the editorial notes of Preston Nichols' book, quote, "While it is indeed healthy to remain skeptical, it is equally healthy to keep an open mind," end quote. Hello everyone, and welcome back to my channel. It has been quite a bit, but this video has taken me so much time to research and so many rabbit holes, along with I read a few different books about this whole entire topic. This was supposed to be part of my Spooktober series, which if you've been here for the past 5 years, I think is when I started it. It's supposed to be the spooky season videos, but I'm clearly very, very late to the party on that one. But I will leave a link to all of my Spooktober videos in the description box below. Hey everyone, Editing Monica here. I just wanted to say that this video is part 1 and part 2 put together. So if you hear me say part 1 and part 2 throughout the video, don't worry about it. This is the full series. I'm putting them together, but unfortunately, since I made them at 2 separate times, I might say part 1 and part 2 a few times. But just know this is the whole entire series put together, and I am going to try to make sure there aren't any weird cuts in between the part 1 and the part 2 portion. I don't know if that makes sense. Hopefully I made sense. Anyway, let's get back to the video. The reason why I wanted to go over this, I've actually wanted to cover this topic for quite a few years now because I'm a huge Stranger Things fan, but I just never really got around to it. And I figured with the last season, by the time that I post this video, probably the last season will have already started. And I figured that if there was any more perfect of a time to do this, it would be now. For legal purposes, I do have to say that all of this is alleged. And if I get anything wrong or miss something, please leave it in the comment section below. There are so many rabbit holes to go down when it comes to some of the things that will be discussed in this 2-part series. And there's also a lot of he said, she said type stuff as well. But with that said, I welcome any corrections to any part of this series or any information I may have not gone over. There will be chapters listed below so you can go ahead and skip around, or if there's something that kind of piques your interest a little bit more than others, then all of that will be below. But anyway, without further ado, let's just get right into it. During present day, Camp Hero is actually a state park, which I can definitely see why, because I will post pictures and videos and stuff throughout this video, but it is absolutely beautiful when I see all the pictures and the videos, so I can definitely see why it was turned into a state park. However, it wasn't always just a beautiful park. In the 1940s, Montauk was disguised as a small fishing village, but it was first commissioned by the U.S. Army in 1942 as a coastal defense station. Quote, 3 gun batteries, 2 with two 16-inch guns and 1 with 2-inch guns, were installed at Camp Hero to defend New York against a possible attack by German ships and submarines. The enormous concrete batteries are closed to visitors and tightly sealed. They seem to recede into their respective hillsides, vines creeping up, nature slowly reclaiming what was built here without its permission. Someone or something has scratched the words, "Stranger, help me," into the concrete. End quote. As already stated, the government was trying to disguise Camp Hero as a coastal fishing village. They would do this by designing the official military structures of the base and making them look like cottages, and the gym on the base was actually, it looked like a church. In 1947, the Army deactivated the base and removed its coastal artillery. Just a few years later, in 1951, Camp Hero would be transferred over to the Air Force, and this is when they would install that radar tower that you see in all of the pictures. The Air Force would remain active on Camp Hero until 1982, and due to the land being deemed environmentally important because of the ecosystems and the animal life and all of those kinds of things, it was donated to the National Park Service in 1984. The National Park Service transferred ownership to the New York State Parks Department, and the park had been open to the public in 2002. However, residents have said that there's more than meets the eye when it comes to this place. Some people have noticed men in black, which is kind of the thing that you always hear when it comes to the government and the conspiracy theories and all of that kind of stuff, government cover-ups and all of that kind of stuff. So kind of like the government boogeyman, I would say. So you hear a lot of stories about the men in black, or like I just said, the government boogeyman. They've talked about these men in black entering underground tunnels, how there's been weird activity and just kind of weird vibrations, meaning like strange sounds vibrating. And there was this one story that I found on Reddit. Now, I know it's Reddit, so I understand that you can question the validity of this. And I understand, again, it's just a he said, she said thing. But I thought it was interesting, and I think that we should go ahead and read this story. So let me just pull it up real quick because, I mean, if we're talking about all these conspiracy theories and everything, I think we should go over some of the first-hand accounts, if you will. So I'm obviously going to go ahead and put the Reddit post up on the screen, but the title of it, it says, "Credibility of Preston Nichols and Al Bielek. What are your thoughts on the claims of these two men who claim to have seen the future, etc.? I personally found their claims rather far-fetched." I decided to scroll down and kind of read the comments and everything, and one person posted this really interesting story, and it said, "Back in 2019, I had a very strange encounter on Montauk Highway right outside Camp Hero. At the time, I didn't know the significance of that place. My brother and I had just driven our 74 Beetle we just finished restoring out to Montauk Lighthouse. We stopped to make some adjustments as my brother was under the car. I had the rear hatch open, and out of nowhere, this guy pops up and goes, 'Oh good, you found the motor.' Dumb rear engine joke in the Beetle community. Literally everyone goes, the motor's in the back when you have the front hatch open." This is really off topic, but yes, I actually do know that. My uncle had a really old Volkswagen, like I said, off topic, in Poland, and yeah, the motor is in the back. Anyway, keep in mind Montauk Highway is kind of desolate and areas one road in and out, not much around besides the woods and dunes. This guy pulls out a wad of cash, and I distinctly remember because he had all old bills that aren't in circulation anymore. He says, "Put your hand out," and starts placing $5 bills in my hand while telling me about how he's an engineer and he used to work for all these big tech companies like Boeing and Lockheed Martin. And he says, "If anyone asks, I'm paying you for your time as a contractor, so you are not liable." He goes on to say he's being watched right now by men in a van. I was half paying attention, but when he said that, I looked down the road, which was previously deserted, and there was a black van parked down the road about 40 yards away with dudes watching us. At this point, he had my full attention. He quickly goes, get in alignment, and check your fan belt, and saunters off into the distance at the same time that van pulls a U-turn and starts following the dude. My brother then comes out from under the car just as confused as I am, with $35 in my hand, and I turn around to show my brother who I was talking to, and they're gone. No van, no man. We even drove in that direction, but no luck. Fast forward to now, I see a video on Insta about Stranger Things and the Montauk Project, and an image flashes of Preston Nichols and his book. I shit you not, that is the man that approached me. I've wondered about this encounter for years and feel confident that was who I was talking to. I recognize his whole body shape right down to his eyes and face. I realize that the internet says he passed away in 2018, but I don't know what else to say. So, again, you know, this is all the weird conspiracy theories and stuff like that. But I thought it was interesting. I know to keep an open mind, and I know that some of this is like the spooky ghost stories that you tell each other or stuff like that. And I mean, it's Reddit, so this could easily be someone that just came on there and came up with a really creative story, and they have a very active imagination. But I still find it kind of interesting because it can be real. I mean, how do we know that it's not real? We don't know that it is, but we also don't know that it's not. So, and I mean, some people may argue, oh, well, he passed away and before this person even saw him, blah, blah, blah. But then we kind of get into the world of the paranormal. Again, some people believe it, some people don't. So, you know, it's kind of one of those weird things.
So that people can actually have parallel lifetimes going on.
Well, time is essentially like a real estate. In other words, as you and I can walk through real estate from point A to point B, all time coexists, and it's possible to go from point A to point B if you can find the path to go directly from. Some people believe it's taking the linear timeline, bending it over next to each other and creating a wormhole or a punch through from time A to time B.
And so when you're existing you're at the same time, literally, like, you know, you can fold it over and wow, here I am what about creating alternate paths then? Are we doing that with our lives because of that ability for time to sort of warp or fold over on itself?
Some of us are doing multiple timelines if we have the capability of going from, let's say, today to 2 weeks ago and working the whole 2 weeks over again. What will happen is the first pass will become an alternate reality. Good morning, people. You already know who I am. I think we'll say at this point that our purpose here is not to prove whether or not this project happened. What we are here is to discuss what they did, how they did it. Mr. Bielek already discussed very well what they did. So we'll go into the meat of it. Essentially, the Montauk Project was a very large mind amplifier. That's essentially all it was. I have here a very simplified block diagram.
You get back on the platform and get you.
Well, the trouble is I'm having trouble seeing the diagram.
Okay, go ahead.
I can be right here. All right. Very simplified was essentially a transmitter. We had an input network, which was the Montauk Chair, that's what we called it. Mr. Cameron, sitting over there in the red shirt, was the psychic that sat in the Montauk Chair and fed information into the computer system. The computer system essentially processed the information and spit it out the transmitter. We had two transmitters, one of two antennas. There was also a Delta T antenna and a 100 kilowatt noise amplifier. This was the basic outlay of the Montauk system.
Experiments, things from his experiments, and as many of you know, Preston Nichols is the scientist from the Montauk Project, and he was the one that was operating the trip chair.
I eventually found myself working out at Montauk Point through Brookhaven National Laboratories on Long Island, and found myself on this screwball project, which was known as Project Red Hawk, was the actual name, but it's popularly become called the Montauk Project, which started with the early STEL, you would know as the Philadelphia experiment. We developed the electromagnetic bottle to hide any sort of a ship in. Up to that point, it was thought that the mind of man had no sensitivity to electromagnetics, which everyone learned quite to their mistake. Yeah, the mind of man is quite sensitive to electromagnetics. And from there, research was done, which I was involved with, of how to interface the mind of man to electromagnetic systems. The idea was you could fly your fighter plane by thought. Your thought would fly the plane or drive the ship. But it evolved into essentially a mind control device, which is what they were really looking for. They wanted to be able to feed a program into an early computer, flip a switch, and everybody would respond to it. That was what they wanted. They never got that. They never could find like a universal psychic signature for all humans. You would have to target each person individually. The individual targeting worked very well. Then it was discovered that since basically the project was nothing but a mind amplifier, that's all it was a mind amplifier. If the person in the input network could think of other times and fully flesh out the time in his head, this machine had the capability of generating that time, generating a vortex, different space and time. And that's what the Montauk Project eventually evolved into, a time machine.
I have an entire video that is dedicated to mostly just talking about the Montauk Project. But before we get into everything, because everything else in this video kind of ties into the Montauk Project, it's all related to one another, I have to give at least a little bit of a background, but the nitty-gritty information will be in the next part of the series. I know that I already said this in the intro, but depending on who you talk to, some people might say that this is just a far-fetched conspiracy theory, and some people will say, no, this is 100% real. And then you'll also have people that say, it could be either or. And that's kind of where I fall, is I'm kind of in the either or, because I mean, in my opinion, for legal purposes, this is all my opinion. I don't want to get sued and I don't need the government coming after me. But in my opinion, because of the government's history and because of things like MK Ultra, I mean, it might seem a little far-fetched, but at the same time, I think some of you get what I'm trying to say. On page 11 of Preston Nichols' book, he stated, quote, "Some of the data you will read in this book can be considered soft facts. Soft facts are not untrue. They are just not backed up by irrefutable documentation. A hard fact would be documentation or hard physical evidence that could stand up to scrutiny. By the nature of the subject matter and security considerations, hard facts about the Montauk Project have been very difficult to obtain. There is also an area between soft and hard which can be termed gray facts. These would be very plausible, but not as easily provable as a hard fact. Any serious investigation will show that a Montauk Project did in fact exist," end quote. He did also continue saying in the book that it's not there to prove anything, it's just to get the story out there, and that it's being presented as non-fiction as it contains no falsehoods to the knowledge of the authors, but depending on what is suitable for the reader, it can also be read as science fiction. Peter Moon, whose real name is Vincent Barbaric, did add his commentary to the version of the book that I actually have, and he stated that this is, quote, "as applicable today as it was when it was written. I would add, however, that Preston Nichols has always tried to avoid hard facts as stated above, not because they do not exist, but rather because, per his statement, he is afraid to prove the Montauk Project for fear of his life. While I believe his fears are past due to the time that has passed since his employment in the defense industry, it does not behoove myself nor anyone else to overlook the trauma he experienced and how this might affect his decision making, end quote. Now that we got all of that out of the way, let's go ahead and just touch base on a very brief overview of the story that inspired Stranger Things. According to Wikipedia, they state, quote, "The Montauk Project is a conspiracy theory that alleges there were a series of United States government projects conducted at Camp Hero or Montauk Air Force Station in Montauk, New York, for the purpose of developing psychological warfare techniques and exotic research, including time travel. The story of the Montauk Project originated in the Montauk Project series of books by Preston Nichols, which intermixes those stories with stories about the Bulgarian experiment," end quote. Now, you can call me a conspiracy theorist or whatever, but I do believe that there are definitely things we don't know about when it comes to the government, and some of these conspiracy theories may have some truth to them. It may not be exactly the way it's been told to the public, but some things are pretty damn believable. Not to mention, it's believed that the Montauk Project was a continuation of MK Ultra, but more underground, as in off the books, a bit more dangerous, and just overall worse than MK Ultra. Now, if you don't know anything about MK Ultra, that is actually the next section of this video, so we will go over it. But if you know a little bit about it, there's a little tidbit that I want to mention here. There were also documents that were destroyed in the process of when everything was kind of ending with MK Ultra. So who's to say that maybe, and again, this is just an opinion, but who's to say that the Montauk Project didn't exist? Because what if it's just like MK Ultra where the documents were destroyed? And if the Montauk Project is a continuation of MK Ultra, well, allegedly that's what's been claimed. But if it is a continuation, maybe they would have learned their lessons, so to speak, from the first round. But again, call me a conspiracy theorist, but I'm just playing devil's advocate here. If you don't know what MK Ultra is, I kind of touched base on this in my video about the arcade game Polybius that I made a few years ago that was part of my Spooktober series. But let's go over what MK Ultra is now. If you haven't been around my channel since, I guess you could kind of say the very beginning, but since my anti-multi-level marketing days, or also referred to as anti-MLM days, you may not know that something I talked a lot about on my channel for a very long time was that of cults and being indoctrinated into cults and commercial cults, things of the like. There's also thought reform, so Lifton's thought reform theory, along with the BITE model by Stephen Hanson, who based the BITE model off of the theory and research of Margaret Singer, Edgar Schein, Louis Joyland West, and others who studied brainwashing in China, as well as cognitive dissonance theory by Leon Festinger. I say all of this because some of our military back in the day is what seems to have kind of started the whole thing behind MK Ultra. Hey everyone, Editing Monica here. I just wanted to say that I was pronouncing Alan Dulles' name incorrectly throughout this portion of the video, and I know that it's Dulles. I'm not sure why. Maybe I just got it into my head and then I just kept saying it over and over again, but I'm very well aware that it's Alan Dulles, not Alan Dulles, so whenever I say Dulles, that's who I'm referring to, Alan Dulles. Anyway, back to the video. Quote, "On April 10th, 1953, Alan Dulles, the newly appointed director of the CIA, delivered a speech to a gathering of Princeton alumni. Though the event was mundane, global tensions were running high. The Korean War was coming to an end, and earlier that week, the New York Times had published a starting story asserting the American POWs returning from the country may have been converted by communist brainwashers. Some GIs were confessing to war crimes like carrying out germ warfare against the communists, a charge the U.S. categorically denied. Others were reportedly so brainwashed that they had refused to return to the United States at all. As if that weren't enough, the U.S. was weeks away from secretly sponsoring the overthrow of a democratically elected leader in Iran. Dulles had just become the first civilian director of an agency growing more powerful by the day, and the speech provided an early glimpse into his priorities for the CIA. In the past few years, we have become accustomed to hearing much about the battle for men's minds, the war of ideologies, he told the attendees. I wonder, however, whether we clearly perceive the magnitude of the problem, whether we realize how sinister the battle for men's minds has become in Soviet hands, he continued. We might call it, in its new form, brain warfare, end quote. Alan Dulles did say the techniques the Soviets used were abhorrent and nefarious. As you can probably imagine, news spread about all of these brainwashing techniques in the 1950s, and paranoia started to sink in with the general public. Enter in MK Ultra. A little side note, or more so just an opinion of mine, I do believe that mind control has been something governments have looked into way before the Soviets and way before MK Ultra. I just think that Alan took what was happening and was able to spin it to be able to start experiments like MK Ultra. That's my opinion though, so don't take that as a fact, obviously. Quote, 3 days after his speech decrying Soviet tactics, Dulles approved the beginning of MK Ultra, a top-secret CIA program for covert use of biological and chemical materials. American values made for good rhetoric, but Dulles had far grander plans for the agency's Cold War agenda. MK Ultra's mind control experiments generally centered around behavior modification via electroshock therapy, hypnosis, polygraphs, radiation, and a variety of drugs, toxins, and chemicals. These experiments relied on a range of test subjects, some who freely volunteered, some who volunteered under coercion, and some who had absolutely no idea they were involved in a sweeping defense research program. From mentally impaired boys at state school to American soldiers to sexual psychopaths at a state hospital. MK Ultra's programs often preyed on the most vulnerable members of society. The CIA considered prisoners especially good subjects as they were willing to give consent in exchange for extra recreation time or commuted sentences, end quote. Now, most of you watching or listening, if not all of you, have heard of the drug LSD. This was part of MK Ultra. But how did the CIA come up with this idea to use LSD? That would be because in the late 1940s, the CIA found out the Soviet Union had been trying to produce LSD, and they attempted to purchase the world's supply of the chemical. One CIA officer stated that the CIA was terrified of the use of LSD in the Soviets' program because of the lack of knowledge about the drug in the United States. Quote, this was the one material that we had ever been able to locate that really had potential fantastic possibilities if used wrongly, end quote. Even with these concerns, on November 18, 1953, 10 scientists would meet at a cabin in the woods of Maryland, which doesn't seem sketchy whatsoever, and that's obviously sarcasm. But after they had spoken for a bit, they decided that in order to understand the value of LSD, quote, an unwitting experiment would be desirable, end quote. So yeah, let's go ahead and use LSD on some people without their consent and see if we can brainwash them into doing the things we want them to, for the sake of science. Now, I do have to say that some people voluntarily took the LSD for the experiment, but a lot of them did it without consent. What's sad is that when I go over some of the victims of these experiments, one of them was part of the experiment for a majority of her pregnancy. They also knew she was pregnant, which is absolutely abhorrent. Because the CIA knew how the public would react to MK Ultra, their methods, and the fact that no one consented to this, well, except for the people that voluntarily took the LSD, which was a very small percentage, but they knew that they had to keep this very hush-hush. Oh, the government hiding things from the public? Big surprise. Well, in my opinion, of course. Quote, precautions must be taken not only to protect operations from exposure to enemy forces, but also to conceal these activities from the American public in general. The knowledge that the agency is engaging in unethical and illicit activities would have serious repercussions in political and diplomatic circles and would be detrimental to the accomplishment of its mission, end quote. As I just went over, the CIA would give LSD to unsuspecting individuals, and sometimes they could find volunteers, but they even slipped the drug into some of the drinks of CIA employees. The LSD experiments would get more and more extensive over time. And this is where I'm going to talk about one of the most notorious of the experiments, and that would be Operation Midnight Climax. According to one source, quote, in 1955, on 225 Chestnut Street, San Francisco, the CIA was devoting substantial attention to decorating a bedroom. George White oversaw the interior renovations. Not much of a decorator, White had a storied career in the Federal Bureau of Narcotics. When the CIA moved into drug experiments, bringing White on board became a top priority. White hung up pictures of French can-can dancers and flowers. He draped lush red bedroom curtains over the windows. He framed a series of posters with black silk mats. For a middle-aged drug bureaucrat, each item evoked sex and glamour. George White wasn't building a normal bedroom. He was building a trap. White then hired a Berkeley engineering student to install bugging equipment and a two-way mirror. White sat behind the mirror, martini in hand, and waited for the action to begin. Sex workers would lure unsuspecting Johns to the bedroom, where the men would be dosed with LSD and their actions observed by White from beyond the mirror. As payment for their services, the sex workers received small amounts of cash, as well as a guarantee from White that he'd intercede when the women inevitably had run-ins with law enforcement in the future, end quote. Now, there was an end or dismantling of MK Ultra, but as I've already said in this video, unfortunately, documents were destroyed, and we're really relying mostly on personal accounts, along with just, there's a few documents that kind of made it through. But yeah, most of the documents were destroyed. The experiments with the LSD did continue into 1963, and then in the spring of 1963, John Vance, who was a member of the CIA Inspector General staff, found out about MK Ultra. The directors of MK Ultra tried to get the CIA's audit board to let them continue on with the research. Fast forward to 1977, quote, Senator Edward Kennedy oversaw congressional hearings investigating the effects of MK Ultra. Congress brought in a roster of ex-CIA employees for questioning, interrogating them about who oversaw these programs, how participants were identified, and if any of these programs had been continued. The hearings turned over a number of disturbing details, particularly about the 1953 suicide of Dr. Frank Olson, an Army scientist who jumped out of a hotel window several days after unwittingly consuming a drink spiked with LSD. Amid growing criminalization of drug users, and just a few years after President Nixon declared the drug abuse as the public enemy number one, the ironies of the United States' troubling experimentation with drugs appeared in sharp relief. But throughout the hearings, Congress kept hitting roadblocks. CIA staffers claimed they couldn't remember details about many of the human experimentation projects or even the number of people involved. The obvious next step would be to consult the records, but that presented a small problem. In 1973, amid mounting inquiries, the director of MK Ultra told workers it would be a good idea if the files were destroyed, citing vague concerns about the privacy and embarrassment of participants. The men who crafted MK Ultra effectively eradicated the paper record for one of the United States' most obviously illegal undertakings. A program born in secrecy would hold onto so many secrets forever, end quote. Not to be too blunt, but what in the actual fuck? But seriously, the fact that they tried to cover it up and say that they're doing it because of some of the embarrassing details, no. That's not why you did it. You did it so that you wouldn't get caught. You did it so that the public wouldn't find out about what the government was allegedly doing to people without their consent. I also slightly call bullshit on not remembering things and not remembering the experiments, because if you were part of this program and if you were doing some of these experiments, how did you not remember? You might not remember the details of every single person, of every single thing that was done to said person, but how do you not remember at least parts of it? There have been a number of victims who have come forward and talked about their experience with MK Ultra and all of what was done to them. Maybe not all of it, because obviously they were drugged for some of it, but they were able to come forward and tell parts of their story. But there have also been a lot of articles written about it and things of that nature. Esther's story is one that really made me incredibly emotional because she was tested on while she was pregnant, and the doctor knew that she was pregnant. The reasoning behind them testing her while she was pregnant was to treat her anxiety during pregnancy, and as someone who suffered from that along with postpartum anxiety, the state of vulnerability that you are in is so upsetting, and I could not imagine going to a doctor hoping to get better. Meanwhile, I'm a victim to an experiment that I didn't consent to. Let's start from the beginning though, so I can give a little more detail to Esther's story. Esther's childhood was anything but easy. Both of her parents passed away at an early age, and Esther was 4 years old when her father passed in 1936, and a year later, her mother had been diagnosed with a brain tumor. The sad part was, in order to treat the brain tumor, her mother was given a lobotomy. Due to the lobotomy, her mother was not fit to take care of Esther and her older brother. In the end, her mother was committed to a psychiatric institution. And the story only gets worse. Esther and her brother moved around from relatives' homes to foster homes and had suffered wherever they were placed. Eventually, Esther decided in her late teens that she was going to train as a nurse and landed a job at the Jewish General Hospital in Montreal. That time in her life would be when she would meet Haskell Schrier on a blind date, and little did she know he would become her future husband in 1955. 3 years after they were married, Esther gave birth to their first child, Lynn Carroll. Sadly, Lynn would pass away at just 3 weeks old due to a staph infection. Medical records did show that she felt responsible for her daughter's death, and I really feel for Esther, and she had gone through so much in her life up until this point that I cannot fathom how she was doing mentally. 2 years after her daughter's death, she became pregnant again. However, she was still processing what had happened and was still feeling responsible and guilty for her daughter's death. Her medical records indicated that she had anxiety over possibly losing another baby. While I was pregnant, I had anxiety the entire pregnancy that something bad would happen. That's why I didn't announce my pregnancy until I couldn't hide it anymore. Anyway, I say all of this to say I understand anxiety during pregnancy, even though it's not because of Esther's reason, but the fear and feeling causing the anxiety is something I'm familiar with. One day, Haskell, Esther's husband, read an article about Dr. Ewan Cameron and the Allen's Hospital reputation when it came to the psychiatric care they offered. Dr. Cameron was a Scottish-born American psychiatrist, and he held different titles at different points in his life, such as director of the Allen Hospital, head of the Canadian and the American Psychiatric Associations, and the World Psychiatric Association. According to Lloyd Schrier, who was the baby Esther was pregnant with, yes, spoiler, he survived the experiments, and he stated that Dr. Cameron was, quote, godlike, end quote, which is a scary abuse of power that, as you will find, and I'm sure you've already assumed, he was in cahoots with the CIA and MK Ultra. 3 years after MK Ultra was launched, the CIA had approached Dr. Cameron after they had learned of his reputation. They had approached him through the Society of Investigation of Human Ecology, which was a research foundation and a front where the CIA funneled money according to one source. The CIA encouraged the doctor to apply for a grant, and from January 1957 to September 1960, he would receive $60,000 US, which in August of 2025, that would be worth a little over $700,000. I almost forgot to tell you why Dr. Cameron had quite the reputation. This was due to his psychiatric research, where he would use extreme sensory deprivation, drugs, and intense repetition via recorded messages. Of course, the CIA would want him to work for them during MK Ultra. Well, unknowingly, Esther Schrier would become a victim to MK Ultra and Dr. Cameron in February of 1960. Her and her family thought the care she would receive would help with her anxiety, not that she would turn into an unethical and inhumane experiment while pregnant. Sadly, she would start off by spending 30 days in the sleep room, which was where patients were put into a drug-induced coma. They would only have the patients wake up for 3 feedings and bathroom breaks per day. You would think that Esther, being pregnant, she would gain weight in a normal situation with no experiments, but since the beginning of her being in the sleep room, she had lost 13 pounds. In addition to that, she couldn't even stand up on her own because of how weak she was. It is abhorrent that this was all done while she was pregnant. It's also disgusting that these doctors and whoever else was performing these experiments were able to sleep at night knowing they were doing this to non-consenting human beings. After the sleep room, she went through a treatment, well, actually, let's call it what it is, an experiment called depatterning. Dr. Cameron did this depatterning method on patients in order to break their minds down to a childlike state. This was done through drugs and electroshock therapy. This way, he could basically wipe their brain and just reprogram them. Quote, part of his reprogramming regime would involve what he dubbed psychic driving, which meant playing recorded messages to the patients for up to 20 hours a day, whether they were asleep or awake. These voices were played through headphones, helmets, or speakers, sometimes installed right inside the patient's pillow. Records show some patients would hear these messages up to 500,000 times, end quote. Esther would be considered completely depatterned by March 12th of 1960, according to her medical records. This meant she was incontinent, mute, and even had trouble swallowing. The baby that she was pregnant with at the time did survive and at one point stated, quote, that's crazy to do that to a pregnant woman. When she woke from the sleep room, she didn't know who my father was. She didn't know it was her husband. I guess she didn't know anything. You know, she used to tell me she had to relearn everything, end quote. You might be wondering if she had any complications throughout any of this experimentation. And I mean, I'm surprised that the baby, her son Lloyd, actually made it out alive. I'm surprised she did as well. She did have some gynecological issues throughout these experiments, and they would have an OB come in and treat her. When this would happen, they would let her rest for 4 to 5 days. Oh, how so terribly nice of them. Obviously sarcasm. By August 17, 1960, only 6 months after she was admitted for what her and her family thought would be a normal treatment to help her, she had undergone 29 electroshock treatments, with them being of the extreme type. However, it stopped at that point because she had reached the 8th month of her pregnancy. So they had no problem doing this the entire time this fetus was developing inside of her. But, because she's at the 8-month mark, somehow that's when they said, okay, enough is enough. I did read up on Dr. Cameron, and what really angers me is that he went through life unscathed, and MK wasn't brought to light until after he died. I was hoping that maybe something would have been done against him, but he died before justice could be served. Lloyd was born on September 27, 1960, and by this point, Esther had felt helpless. She couldn't remember anything, let alone how to take care of a newborn baby. As someone who has experienced postpartum anxiety and depression, I can't imagine going through something like that, in addition to not even remembering how to function like a normal human being and having to relearn everything. Lloyd did state that she didn't even remember how to boil water. There is one picture I came across of Esther with her husband, and he was holding their baby. She just looked so lost, and you can tell that she wasn't okay. It's so heartbreaking to see that because her and her family truly thought she was getting the help she needed, when that was just not the case. Esther would go on to a BBC Scotland interview in 2004 and state, quote, I had a new baby, and I didn't know what to do with the baby. I had help, a baby nurse, but she had to have a day off and left me a book. And I'll just give you a little example from the book. When you hear the baby cry, go to the room, pick up baby, and step by step how to feed the baby. And that was very frightening, end quote. Esther died of cancer at 84 in 2017. Lloyd did state that Esther was able to live a full life. While Lloyd was not sure if any of the experiments did have an actual impact to his health, he said, quote, I think I was lucky. I think the only side effects that I know of, I guess in school, I was a bit slow in the beginning, but I ended up going through high school and we have in Montreal's CEGEP. I did the 2 years and then I went on to McGill and I did a Bachelor of Commerce. So I was able to get my degrees and everything, but I will never know what I could have been, end quote. Many victims of Cameron did come out of the Allen completely broken and were not able to live their lives the way that they once did. The trauma that these experiments caused even ripped apart families and children. Canada never provided a list of victims during Dr. Cameron's reign of terror from 1943 to 1964. The government has never admitted liability or even apologized. Lloyd Schrier said, quote, "I think eventually they should come out with the truth. I think after all this time, I don't know what they're trying to prove, who they're trying to protect. I don't think it's right. I think they should come out and just, deal with it," end quote. Dr. Frank Olson, who was a member of MK Ultra and turned into a victim of MK Ultra as well. Frank Rudolph Emanuel Olson was born to Swedish immigrant parents in Wisconsin on July 10, 1910. He would go on to earn a bachelor's from the University of Wisconsin, and in 1983, he would earn a PhD in bacteriology. He ended up marrying one of his classmates by the name of Alice Smith Wicks, and they would have 3 children together. Frank Olson would enroll in the Reserve Officers Training Corps in order to help alleviate some of the cost he endured during his time in college. Frank worked at Purdue University's Agriculture Experimentation Station before being called to active duty. He was called to active duty at Fort Hood, Texas, and this was when the U.S. entered into World War II. In December of 1942, Frank would receive a call from Ira Baldwin, who would become the future mentor of Sidney Gottlieb, who would become the CIA's leading chemist and director of MK Ultra. This call was Ira asking Frank if he'd like to join him in being part of a secret program regarding the development of biological weapons. Ira wanted Frank to become one of the first scientists in the program at what would be known as Fort Detrick. A few months later, the Chemical Corps took over Fort Detrick and the Biologicals Warfare Laboratories would be born. During this program, Frank would work with ex-Nazis who were brought into the country through Operation Paperclip. Fast forward to 1944, and Frank would be discharged from the Army, but would continue to work at Fort Detrick with a civilian contract. This was so he could continue with his research in aerobiology. Quote, "In 1949, he joined many other Detrick scientists in Antigua for Operation Harness, which tested the vulnerability of different animals to toxic clouds. In 1950, he was a part of Operation Sea Spray, where the bacterium, I'm going to butcher this name, so I'm also going to put it up on the screen, but Serratia marcescens was released into the coastal mist of San Francisco through a minesweeper, reaching all of San Francisco's 800,000 residents, as well as people living in 8 surrounding cities. Olson traveled often to Fort Terry, a secret army base off Long Island, where toxins too deadly to be brought into the U.S. mainland were tested," end quote. In May of 1952, Frank also became part of the Committee for Project Artichoke, which was an experimental CIA interrogation program. Frank Olson's children stated that working at Fort Detrick had affected Frank very deeply. Frank had witnessed and even been a part of poisoning, gassing, and torturing lab animals. Frank's son Eric stated, quote, "He'd come to work in the morning and see piles of dead monkeys. That messes with you. He wasn't the right guy for that," end quote. And I mean, I don't see how anyone could be the right guy for that job. Frank spent a decade at Fort Detrick. He would frequently travel to Germany to witness the interrogation sessions. The victims of these sessions would occasionally die from trauma due to the tactics they used. Frank was also one of the scientists who traveled to or through France during the summer of 1951. This was a summer that an entire village of Point Saint-Esprit was poisoned by a naturally occurring fungus that LSD was derived from. There was a semi-monthly retreat of men who were closest to MK Ultra, and there was one scheduled at a cabin in Deep Creek Lake for Wednesday, November 18th to Friday, November 20th, 1953. There were 12 people who were on the list of men who would meet at the cabin: Frank Olson, Lieutenant Colonel Vincent Ruitt, who was Frank's supervisor, John L. Schwab, John Stubbs, Benjamin Wilson, Herbert Burt Tanner, John C. Milanovsky, Gerald Yonetz, Sidney Gottlieb, Robert Lashbrook, A. Hughes, and Henry Bortner. Now, this might not come as a surprise, but on November 19th at around 7:30, Frank and some other men from this meeting were drugged with a potential truth serum, which many years later was found to be LSD. The next morning, Frank went back to Maryland. However, he was not the same Frank anymore. When he got home, he sat down for dinner with his family and he refused to eat. He seemed very distant and didn't really acknowledge his children. Frank had also told his wife that he made a terrible mistake. On November 23rd, Frank and his boss, Lieutenant Colonel Vincent Ruett, made it to work at Fort Detrick, and they were both still not back to normal. According to Vincent Ruett, Frank seemed to be a little agitated, and Frank had asked if he should be fired or quit. Vincent was able to calm him down a bit, but Frank only got worse as the days went on. Frank was disoriented and felt weird about all of the work that he had been doing, along with feeling incompetent in his field. On Tuesday, November 24th, Frank went to work, but this time around, he somehow ended up at home before noon, and his coworker John Stubbs was with him. Frank told his wife that John Stubbs had come home with him because, quote, "they're afraid I might hurt you," end quote, which I'm sure could have been a bit unsettling for his wife. Frank also told her that he had agreed to undergo a psychiatric treatment of some sort. After this interaction, Frank Ruett and a CIA chemist named Robert Lashbrook flew to New York City to meet Harold Abramson, who was linked to the CIA as a medical doctor and had worked with Frank earlier on. 4 days later in New York City, on Saturday, November 28th, 1953, at around 2 a.m., while staying at the Statler Hilton Hotel, formerly known as Hotel Pennsylvania, Frank Olson jumped out of his window and landed on the sidewalk. The manager, who was working, ran to Frank, who somehow was still alive when he hit the pavement, and he stated that Frank tried to mumble something or tell him something, but unfortunately, Frank would pass away before medical help showed up. Here is where this whole situation gets even more sketchy than it already was, because I'm sure most of us who have our tinfoil hats on can agree that this is already a sketchy situation. However, many years later, the manager who found Frank on the sidewalk did say, quote, "In all of my years in the hotel business, I never encountered a case where someone got up in the middle of the night, ran across a dark room in his underwear, avoiding two beds, and dove through a closed window with the shade and curtains drawn," end quote. Now, to add to the sketchiness even more, that night after Frank had jumped to his death, when police went into the room where Frank was staying, they found Robert Lashbrook sitting on the toilet in the bathroom. In addition to all of this, the hotel's switchboard operator reported having connected a call from room 1018A to a number listed as belonging to Dr. Harold Abramson. According to the operator, who overheard the entirety of the brief call, the occupant in 1018A reported, "Well, he's gone," to which the call's recipient had replied, "Well, that's too bad," end quote. Excuse me, what? I would normally say something such as, why didn't the police investigate this further or try to get to the bottom of it? But I mean, how is New York City police going to investigate the CIA and hire government officials? Well, it only gets worse, and I think we can agree this is of no surprise. Quote, "At the scene and in their written report, the two police officers discussed similarities to the 1948 Lawrence Duggan case, in which a high-level government official suspected of espionage died after plummeting from his New York office. The ensuing police report said that on his last night in Manhattan, Olson purposely threw himself out of the window of his 10th floor hotel room at the Hotel Statler, which he had been sharing with Lashbrook, and died shortly after impact," end quote. Frank Olson's family never really got any details about Frank's death. All they knew was that he fell or jumped after suffering a fatal nervous breakdown. At least this was until the year 1975, because that is when the Rockefeller Commission exposed some of MK Ultra's activities. That was the same year that the government would admit to drugging Frank with LSD without his knowledge. Once the family stated that they planned to sue the CIA for Frank's wrongful death, the government offered an out-of-court settlement of $1.25 million, which they later decreased to $750,000, which they accepted. This $750,000 would be almost $7 million in September of 2025, according to the inflation calculator that I used. President Gerald Ford and CIA Director William Colby did apologize to the family for the negligence of the CIA. There was a man by the name of Hunter White who had actually been, I guess you can say, Frank's handler during his stay in New York before he died. However, Hunter had to leave to take care of his sick mother, but after Hunter White had passed away, his wife decided she would donate all of his written information to Foothill College in 1977. The CIA had redacted many of the documents, but they also obtained many of them for use in the CIA's Victim Task Force, which was designed to reach settlements with victims of MKUltra. In 1994, Eric Olson, who was Frank's son, had his father's body exhumed so that he could be buried with his mother, and at this time, the family decided to have a second autopsy performed. This was because in the medical report after Frank Olson died, it stated that there were cuts and abrasions on the body, and there were many theories about Frank being allegedly assassinated instead of committing suicide. The second autopsy had shown that they weren't able to find cuts or abrasions that they were in the original report, but they did report that they found a large hematoma on the left side of Frank's head and a large injury on his chest. Most of the team that did this second autopsy decided that the blunt force trauma to the head and the injury to the chest did not occur during the fall, but most likely before the fall. The evidence concluded that Frank's death was, quote, rankly and starkly suggestive of homicide, end quote. Unfortunately, Frank Olson's family never found out the truth, and maybe even some of his family is still trying to find out.
I'm Chris DiNicola, born July of 1962, rendering me 32 years of age. I was a subject in radiation as well as mind control and drug experiments performed by a man I knew as Dr. Green. My parents were divorced around 1966, and Donald Richard Ebner, my natural father, was involved with Dr. Green in the experiments. I was a subject from 1966 to 1976. Dr. Green performed radiation experiments on me in 1970, focusing on my neck, throat, and chest, 1972 focusing on my chest and my uterus in 1975. Each time I became dizzy, nauseous, and threw up. All these experiments were performed on me in conjunction with mind control techniques and drugs in Tucson, Arizona. Dr. Green was using me mostly as a mind control subject from 1966 to 1973. His objective was to gain control of my mind and train me to be a spy assassin. The first significant memory took place at Kansas City University in 1966. Don Ebner took me there by plane when my mom was out of town. I was in what looked like a laboratory, and there seemed to be other children. I was strapped down, naked, spread eagle, on a table, on my back. Dr. Green had electrodes on my body, including my head. He used what looked like an overhead projector and repeatedly said he was burning different images into my brain while a red light flashed aimed at my forehead. In between each sequence, he used electric shock on my body and told me to go deeper and deeper, while repeating each image would go deeper into my brain, and I would do whatever he told me to do. I felt drugged because he had given me a shot before he started the procedure. When it was over, he gave me another shot. The next thing I remember, I was with my grandparents again in Tucson, Arizona. I was 4 years old. You can see from this experiment that Dr. Green used trauma, drugs, post-hypnotic suggestion, and more trauma in an effort to gain total control of my mind. He used me in radiation experiments both for the purposes of determining the effects of radiation on various parts of my body and to terrorize me as an additional trauma in the mind control experiments. The rest of the experiments took place in Tucson, Arizona, out in the desert. I was taught how to pick locks, be secretive, use my photographic memory, and a technique to withhold information by repeating numbers to myself. Dr. Green moved on to wanting me to kill dolls that looked like real children. I stabbed a doll with a spear once after being severely traumatized, but the next time I refused. He used many pain induction techniques, but as I got older, I resisted more and more. He often tied me down in a cage, which was near his office. Between 1972 and 1976, he and his assistants were sometimes careless and left the cage unlocked. Whenever physically possible, I snuck into his office and found files with reports and memos addressed to CIA and military personnel. Included in these files were project, subproject, subject, and experiment names with some code numbers for radiation and mind control experiments, which I have submitted in your written documentation. I was caught twice, and Dr. Green ruthlessly used electric shock, drugs, spun me on a table, put shots in my stomach, in my back, dislocated my joints, and hypnotic techniques to make me feel crazy and suicidal. Because of my rebellion and growing lack of cooperation, they gave up on me as a spy assassin. Consequently, the last 2 years, 1974 to 1976, Dr. Green used various mind control techniques to reverse the spy assassin messages to self-destruct and death messages. His purpose? He wanted me dead, and I struggled to stay alive all of my adult life. I believe it is by the grace of God that I am still alive. These horrible experiments have profoundly affected my life. I developed multiple personality disorder because Dr. Green's goal was to split my mind into as many parts as possible so he could control me totally. He failed, but I've had to endure years of constant physical, mental, and emotional pain, even to this day. I've been in therapy consistently for 12 years, and it wasn't until I found my current therapist 2.5 years ago, who had knowledge of the mind control experiments, that I've finally been able to make real progress and begin to heal. In closing, I ask that you keep in mind that the memories I've described are but a glimpse of the countless others that took place over the 10 years between 1966 and 1976. That they weren't just radiation, but mind control and drug experiments as well. I have included more detailed information of what I remember in your written documentation. Please help us by recommending an investigation and making the information available so that therapists and other mental health professionals can help more people like myself. I know I can get better. I am getting better. And I know others can too, with the proper help. Please help us in an effort to prevent these heinous acts from continuing in the future. Thank you very much.
Between the years of 1957 and 1984, I became a pawn in a government scheme whose ultimate goal was mind control and to create the perfect spy, all through the use of chemicals, radiation, drugs, hypnosis, electric shock, isolation in tubs of water, sleep deprivation, brainwashing, verbal, physical, emotional, and sexual abuse. I was exploited unwittingly for nearly 3 decades of my life, and the only explanations given to me were that, quote, the end justifies the means, and, quote, I was serving my country in their bold effort to fight communism. I can only summarize my circumstances by saying they took an already abused 7-year-old child and compounded my suffering beyond belief. The saddest part is, I know for a fact that I was not alone. There were countless other children in my same situation, and there was no one to help us until now. I've already submitted as much information as possible, including conversations overheard of the people, agencies responsible. I'm able to report all this to you in such detail because of my photographic memory and the arrogance of the doctors, the arrogance of the people involved. They were certain they would always control my mind. Although the process of recalling these atrocities is not an easy one, nor is it without some danger to myself and my family, I feel the risk is worth taking. Dr. L. Wilson Green, who claimed to have received $50 million from the Edgewood Chemical and Radiology Laboratory as part of the TSD, or Technical Science Division of the CIA, once described to Dr. Charles Brown that, quote, children were used as subjects because they were more fun to work with and cheaper too. They needed lower profile subjects than soldiers or government people. so only young, willing females would do. Besides, he said, I like scaring them. They in the agency think I'm a god, creating subjects, experiments for whatever deviant purposes Sid and James can think up. Sid being Dr. Sidney Gottlieb, James, Dr. James Hamilton. In 1958, I was to be tested, they told me, by some important doctors from the society, or the Human Ecology Society, and I was instructed to cooperate. I was told not to look at anyone's faces and try hard not to ignore any names, as this was a very secret project. But I was told to be brave, and all these things would help me forget. Naturally, as most children do, I did the opposite and remembered as much as I could. Dr. John Gittinger tested me, Dr. Cameron gave me the shocks, and Dr. Green the x-rays. Then I was told by Sid Gottlieb that, quote, I was right for the big A, or meaning artichoke. By the time I left to go home, just like every time from then on, I would remember only whatever explanations Dr. Robert G. Heath at Tulane Medical University gave me for the odd bruises, needle marks, burns on my head, fingers, and even the genital soreness. I had no reason to believe otherwise. They had already begun to control my mind. The next year, I was sent to a lodge in Maryland called Deep Creek Cabins to learn how to sexually please men. I was taught how to coerce them into talking about themselves, and it was Richard Helms, who was deputy director of the CIA, Dr. Gottlieb, Captain George White, Morris Allen, who all planned on filming as many high government agency officials and heads of academic institutions and foundations as possible, so that later when the funding for mind control and radiation started to dwindle, projects would continue. I was used to entrap many unwitting men, including themselves, all with the use of a hidden camera. I was only 9 years old when this sexual humiliation began. I overheard conversations about a part of the agency called ORD, which I found out was Office of Research and Development. It was run by Dr. Green, Dr. Stephen Aldrich, Martin Orne, and Morris Allen. Once a crude remark was made by Dr. Gottlieb about a certain possible leak over New Orleans East involving a large group of retarded children who are being given massive doses of radiation. He asked, why was Wilson so worried about a few retarded kids? After all, they would be the least likely to spill the beans. Another time, I heard Dr. Martin Orne, who was the director then of the scientific office and later the head of the Institute for Experimental Research, state that, quote, in order to keep more funding coming from different sources for radiation and mind control projects, he suggested stepping up the amounts of stressors used and also the blackmail portion of the experiments. He said it needed to be done faster than to get rid of the subjects, or they were asking for us to come back later and haunt them with our remembrances. There's much more I could tell you about government-sponsored research, including project names, sub-project numbers, people involved, facilities used, tests, and other forms of pain induction. But I think I've given more than enough information to recommend further investigation of all the mind control projects, especially as they involve so much use of the radiation. I would love nothing more than to say that I dreamed all this up and need just to forget it. But that would be a tragic mistake. It would also be a lie. All these atrocities did occur to me and to countless other children, and all under the guise of defending our country. It is because of the cumulative effects of exposure to radiation, chemicals, drugs, pain, and subsequent mental and physical distress that I've been robbed of the ability to work and even to bear any children of my own. It is blatantly obvious that none of this was needed, nor should it ever have been allowed to take place at all. And the only means we have to seek out the awful truth and bring it to light is by opening whatever files remain on all the projects and through another presidential commission on mind control. I believe that every citizen of this nation has the right to know just what is fact and what is fiction. It is our greatest protection against the possibility of this ever happening again. In conclusion, I can offer you no more than what I've given you today, the truth, and I thank you for your time.
I was given a glass of Kool-Aid, and so were the other children. This Kool-Aid was spiked with LSD. It was horrible. I was having trouble with my parents. My father and my stepmother decided to put me in the Allen Memorial Institute. They had no idea what went on in there. I was 16 when I was there. That was beside my bed constantly, repeated 250,000 and 500,000 times. Well, there's a lot I could not remember after I got out of the Allen. When my family came, I was a zombie. I didn't even know who they were. I am on medication now because of what happened to me when I was 16. I have not had any compensation or apology. I want everyone to know in Canada what went on in that horrible, horrible hospital.
My father was a victim of Dr. Cameron. He was a 27-year-old, healthy skier, canoeer, very athletic, and he had asthma. They told him if he went to the Allen Memorial, they could cure his asthma. He also was put in an insulin coma for 36 days with a recording beside him saying that your mother hates you over and over and over and over and over. He received 54 high voltage shock treatments, followed by 54 grand mal seizures. He never came out the same. He had a blank look in his eye. He didn't know who we were. He didn't know we were his daughters. He lost his job. We went into poverty after he came out. They all were behind it. They all knew what they were doing, but they weren't doing it out of care or love. They were doing it out of military and political reasons.
My father, Charles, was a patient of Dr. Cameron's. He had a trigeminal neuralgia, it's called, where there's a pain in the temple that radiates into the jaw that apparently is excruciatingly painful. They told him that it was psychosomatic, which it's not, but in those days, what did they know? So they sent him to a shrink. This shrink that he went to was working with Cameron, although we didn't know. So he put my father right into the program. They immediately put him on insulin to put him into like an insulin coma. They took clips from the interview with the shrink and put it on tape to run a loop under his pillow while he was put into this sleep treatment. Russell shock treatment is approximately 40 to 75 times the strength of a normal shock treatment. So it's really designed to wipe out the memory. After 27 days of this, they said that they were discouraged because he still had ties to his former life, in that he was asking to see his wife. They decided to give him more Page Russell shock treatments and put him to sleep for another 30 days. He had said in his interview with the shrink that I was the apple of his eye. And after he came home, he started beating me not long after.
Thinking that, they would be helped. Little knowing that Dr. Cameron's goal was to depattern them, to wipe out their memory. No one signed to be experimented on. Nobody.
Eventually, some of his patients from the 50s and 60s received some compensation from the CIA and the federal government. But Marlene's family was told they didn't qualify because her aunt was a patient before the funding began.
That right away triggered anger in me and resentment. Why she refused? I want people to know that this was happening long before 1950.
Phyllis Goldberg was 19 when her uncle and sister admitted her to the Allen Memorial Institute. She was studying to be a nurse and started suffering from depression.
My uncle, especially being a physician, felt, wow, she's going to get the best care. She's going to see a world-class, up-and-coming, psychiatrist that's going to help her.
Instead, this is what she received. Her 1948 medical records show 9 electroshock treatments and 28 sleep-induced comas in less than a month.
She could not live a normal life. She could not get married. She could not have children. She was deprived of all those things. Her only pleasure in life was eating candy. She was reduced like I said, down to a child.
Her condition continued to worsen after her release. By the age of 60, she could no longer speak or even move. She passed away at 86.
And every time I put my hand on her head, she would cringe. And I didn't understand until I realized, because of the electric shock treatment that was put on their heads, and for the deprivation, sensory deprivation, that she had to wear all these headphones.
The family has been searching for answers, unable to even access most of her medical records, told by the Royal Victoria Hospital until recently that the records were impossible to find.
You become suspicious. Why can't you find these files? Why are they keeping them?
Tomorrow, a look at Marlene's decades-old fight to hold those responsible accountable for their actions.
I've tried to lay it to rest, but there's always something that comes back to remind me I can't stop.
For City News in Montreal, I'm Tina Teneriello.
The Montauk Project was a theory that started circulating in the 1980s, and this was thanks to two men by the name of Preston Nichols and Al Bielek. The way that I'm going to structure this part of the video is not in chronological order. I'm going to go over Al Bielek's story about the Philadelphia experiment first, and then I'll go into the Montauk Project and Preston Nichols's experience with that. Hey everyone, Editing Monica here. I did also just want to say that even though I'm presenting information about the Philadelphia experiment from first-hand accounts, there is an article I found that stated the Eldridge wasn't in the Philadelphia shipyard in October of 1943, but it was actually in the New York shipyard in October of 1943. Then there's another article that states the following, quote, "As per Edward Dungeon, who was aboard the USS Engstrom, USS Eldridge was carrying classified devices on board, none of which is a teleportation device. Dungeon was in dry dock aboard another destroyer, the USS Engstrom, when the event took place. The Eldridge was in fact using an amplified degaussing technique to try and scramble the ship's magnetic signature. It was hoped that this system would protect the ship from sea mines that could detect a ship's magnetic field as it passed over or near the mine. Contrary to Hollywood movies, most torpedoes didn't hit the sides of ships. They detonated underneath them with a magnetic trigger that could sense the ship's magnetic signature. It was hoped that this degaussing method might also throw off torpedoes as well." Then they go ahead and talk about the green glow that was around the ship, and it says, quote, "The green glow was probably due to an electric storm or St. Elmo's fire. As for Eldridge's mysterious appearance in Norfolk and sudden return to Philadelphia, Dungeon explained that the Navy used inland canals off limits to commercial vessels to make the trip in 6 hours rather than 2 days." End quote. With all of that being said, it is up to you, the viewer, to decide what you think about the Philadelphia experiment, but it's still an interesting story to tell, and who really knows what the truth is behind all of this. But let's go ahead and talk about the story from Al Bielek and Preston Nichols's point of view. According to Preston Nichols' book, the Montauk Project goes all the way back to 1943 when radar and visibility was being researched. Their research took place on the USS Eldridge. Due to the Eldridge being stationed at the Philadelphia Navy Yard, anything that happened to the ship would be called the Philadelphia experiment. The Philadelphia experiment was also known as the Rainbow Project to the people who were behind this project. This was top secret, and it would supposedly end World War II, and that's because the experimentation that was happening was making a ship invisible to enemy radar. This would be done by using an electromagnetic bottle, which would divert waves around the ship. Well, even though they were just trying to figure out a way to make this ship undetectable to radar, things took a turn for the worse, and the ship became invisible to the naked eye and then left the space-time continuum. Not too long after the ship came back, it was actually in Norfolk, Virginia, hundreds of miles away from its original spot, which was Philadelphia. So I guess you can say technically the project was successful, however, it was not for the people involved. The surviving crew was in such a state of disorientation that would actually be the reason they would be discharged for being mentally unfit, while the rest had been planted into the bulkheads of the ship itself. With the crew being discharged as mentally unfit, this would obviously make whatever stories they told as discredited, and obviously nobody's going to believe them if they're deemed mentally unfit. The Rainbow Project was at a standstill at this point, and according to the book, the Rainbow Project would start up again in the late 1940s. Then it would lead to a hole being ripped through time and space at Montauk in 1983. Quote, I believe that the experiment with the invisible ship did take place and that it was a disaster to the men involved. The government does not like to admit such mistakes, and that could be the reason why the official story has never been released. As for the brains behind the experiment, I believe that Nikola Tesla devised the apparatus before he died. Tesla had more experience than anybody else in the world in the field of high-energy physics, and his experiments in 1900 producing artificial light on a large scale has never been duplicated to this day. It has been said that he was 100 years ahead of his time, and his inventions dealing with electricity definitely indicated he was thinking into the far future, end quote. Now, it wasn't until 1989, specifically in Phoenix, Arizona, at the UFO New Age conference, that Al Bielek would come forward and not only say that he was a part of the Philadelphia experiment, but obviously he was a survivor of the Philadelphia experiment. Al had claimed that the beginning stages of the experiment started in Chicago in 1931. The team of scientists that had started working on invisibility consisted of John Hutchinson's, the dean of the University of Chicago, Nikola Tesla, and Dr. Emil Kurtenauer, an Austrian who had a PhD degree in physics. According to Al, quote, although it was a private research operation, it was apparently funded by the Navy from the very beginning. It was soon moved to the East Coast and wound up at the Institute for Advanced Studies at Princeton University, which had been formed in 1933. Einstein and a number of very interesting people became associated with the Institute, but one of the first, and perhaps one of the youngest members that they had join them in 1933, was Dr. John Eric von Neumann, end quote. Nikola Tesla had also allegedly rejoined the program in the late 1930s. Nikola Tesla had been assigned to several government projects, one of which was the Philadelphia experiment. According to Al, even though Tesla had been part of the experiment, and also he was the first director of the experiment, Al believed that the best contributor to this project was actually Dr. John von Neumann. The ironic part about all of this is that Al Bielek actually started researching the Philadelphia experiment in the 1960s as just a research project. He had no idea at the time of starting his research that he was a part of the project itself. Al Bielek claimed that he had lived a double life. One as Alfred Bielek and one as Edward A. Cameron. His brother was Duncan Cameron, and they were the sons of Alexander Duncan Cameron Sr., who was a wealthy ex-Navy man. Now, remember the name Duncan Cameron because it will come up later in Preston Nichols' part of his story. According to Al, his brother Duncan had gotten his PhD in physics from the University of Edinburgh in Scotland, and Al got his PhD in physics at Harvard. But this is when he was living his life as Edward Cameron. Unfortunately, Al didn't have documented proof of his time in the school as Edward, but he had flashbacks to classes and professors. Edward and Duncan had joined a naval officers training program because of their father, and in September of 1939, they were assigned to Providence, Rhode Island at the officers training school. Then, in September of 1940, Edward and Duncan applied coils and generators to a minesweeper and accomplished a successful transition to invisibility. When Al was asked about how there was a successful invisibility experiment prior to the Philadelphia experiment, he said, quote, yes, but we used no personnel on board the minesweeper. We used only the ship. The experiment was heavily classified, of course, end quote. Al would go on to say that while he lived as Edward, he wasn't concerned being around all of the powerful electromagnetic and radio frequency fields. However, someone who was concerned was Nikola Tesla. This was because he had found that the next invisibility experiment would involve actual people, which would be the crew aboard the USS Eldridge. Al believed that Tesla had some kind of extraterrestrial connection because of how much knowledge he had, and maybe Tesla had talked to said being every day. Eventually, Nikola Tesla told the Navy to give the project that would be known as the Philadelphia experiment a little more time, but because there was a war going on, he was told to just make it work. In March of 1942, they used a test ship to make it invisible, but nothing happened. Al would go on to say that he thinks Tesla deliberately sabotaged the experiment because he didn't want to do the actual experiment on human lives, which we all know how that went anyway when they went ahead and did the experiment without Nikola Tesla. So if this is in fact true, Nikola Tesla's suspicions were correct. 10 months after the failed experiment on January 7th, 1943, Nikola Tesla was found dead in his hotel room. Al Bielek said that he and his brother Duncan were both concerned when Nikola had left the project because they knew they would be the human subjects on the ship when it would be time to experiment with actual people on the ship. And this is when Al was living his life as Edward. I know, it gets a little bit confusing, so I'm going to try my best to kind of make sense here, but Al and Edward are the same person. It's just Al was the person who didn't know about the experiment, and Edward was the one in the experiment. So hopefully, like I said, I'm going to do my best to not confuse everybody here. Once Tesla left, Dr. Newman was in charge, and on July 20th, they were ready for the experiment. Following on July 22nd, when they flipped the main switch and the USS Eldridge had gone invisible to radar and visual contact for 20 minutes. Al had said that after that 20 minutes when they came back, because this is in his words obviously, quote, "We returned 20 minutes later with most of the crew demented. My brother and I must have been spared because we were in the hold, and much of the experiment was on deck. In the spite of heavy loss of personnel to hysteria and near insanity, we were given 21 days to try it again. This time, they told us we would try only for radar invisibility, not optical invisibility. After all, the most important thing was to confuse enemy radar. It was not really necessary to be invisible. Besides, what if invisible ships started ramming into each other with the radar ineffective? On August 12th, with the new crew, the experiment began afresh. For 60 to 70 seconds, the Eldridge was invisible to radar. Then there was a blue flash and the ship disappeared. There was not even a waterline to mark its invisible presence. It was gone. For 4 hours, it was gone." End quote. You might be wondering where Al and his brother Duncan went or what happened to them within that 4 hours. Since they saw the crewmen going crazy, they decided to jump off the ship. Here's the part of the story that gets interesting. They didn't land in the water. They somehow landed at the Montauk base, and Dr. Newman was already waiting for both of them. It was 1983, but somehow Dr. Newman died in 1957. So Al and Duncan somewhat or somehow traveled into the future. According to Al, quote, "And guess what had been pulled along with us? Between August 4th and August 12th, we had sighted UFOs hovering over the Eldridge. Well, a UFO was sucked along with us to Montauk and it was dismantled there." End quote. According to Al, even though him and Duncan had made it through the experiment unscathed, he did believe it had to do with them being in the hold. However, he believed that if they would have done this experiment one day earlier or later, the crewmen wouldn't have been hurt the way that they were. The date was significant because one of the most important pieces of equipment that they had with them on the Eldridge was that of Tesla's zero-time generator. Quote, "This incredible device was created to lock into the basic zero time of our galaxy. It provides a physical, cosmological lockup that must be in place before one can attempt any exotic experiments in teleportation, invisibility, or whatever." End quote. Al claimed that the UFOs were trying to tell humans not to attempt the experiment on August 12th. This was due to the Earth's biorhythm and how there is a 20-year peak that occurred on that specific year and date, August 12th, 1943. That's why they were pulled into space and traveled 40 years into the future. Quote, as Dr. Newman explained, what he needed in 1943 to assure the experiment's success was a computer. Each individual has his own individual time lock reference. When this reference is disrupted by extreme power, people can literally be torn away from their moments in time and drift away into another point of time. Although von Neumann believed that he had correctly calculated the zero time reference, only a computer could have done so for each crewman. Therefore, some of the men did not come back to the precise moment in the past or present of 1943 in which they had left, and they only had to be off by a millisecond to find themselves embedded in a steel bulkhead. Others were glowing. Most of the rest were insane. Only those shielded by steel walls or decking survived, end quote. According to Al, the Edgeridge went on to perform another experiment around October 27th, but this time there were no people aboard the ship. The ship would end up becoming damaged, but returned to duty until 1946. Then in 1951, the Eldridge was transferred to the Greek Navy. There was an experiment like this performed with a plane, which was successful, but a year later, the pilot had gone up with someone and somehow the pilot disappeared from the cockpit. And since the person that was brought into the plane was not a pilot, the jet crashed. Only one body was recovered from the crash, and it wasn't the pilot's. The pilot just disappeared, never to be seen again. Al Bielek claims that his brother Duncan was pulled back to 1983, and he died within 3 days due to old age. This was due to him aging about a year an hour. Duncan's soul was introduced to a body that was born in 1951 because supposedly secret government agencies are able to put souls from previous physical bodies that had passed into new bodies. For some unknown reason to Al, him and his brother were not able to die. They had to be kept alive somehow. Now, when Al was Edward, he was somehow assigned, I guess you could say, to the background and the body of Al Bielek, who was born in 1927. So you might be wondering, how did Al Bielek come to figure out that he was Edward Cameron in a previous life? Especially because he was researching the Philadelphia experiment in the 1960s and everything of that nature. But the reasoning behind it, if you for some reason guess brainwashing, that is the answer. It's because he was brainwashed. Allegedly, of course. And this brings me to 1985 when Al Bielek would go ahead and visit Montauk. And then in 1988, there was actually a movie that came out about the Philadelphia experiment, and that would trigger something within Al's brain or his memories or whatever that would kind of just bring everything back and remind him of his previous life. After Al had this revelation, I guess you can call it, he called Duncan Cameron, his brother, or who he believed was his brother, and he ended up talking to him about it, and he said that you're actually my brother, and he explained all of this to him, and Duncan Cameron said, yeah, I knew all of this, I was just waiting for you to figure it all out. Now, there is a lot more to Al Bielek's story, and it has to do with UFOs and extraterrestrials and all of that kind of stuff, but that could be a whole video of itself because there's just so much more information, especially in the book that I got Al's story from. But yeah, so there's obviously more things that are tied to it from Al's side, but I did just want to give kind of like a brief overview. So obviously there's more that could be tied to Al's story. So if you're interested in that video, let me know in the comment section below. And yeah, let's go ahead and move on to the next topic, which is that of the Montauk Project.
Good morning, people. You already know who I am. I think we'll say at this point that our purpose here is not to prove whether or not this project happened. What we are here is to discuss what they did, how they did it. Mr. Bielek already discussed very well what they did. So we'll go into the meat of it. Essentially, the Montauk Project was a very large mind amplifier. That's essentially all it was. I have here a very simplified block diagram.
You get back up on the platform and get you.
Well, the trouble is I'm having trouble seeing the diagram.
Okay, go ahead.
I can be right here. All right. Very simplified, was essentially a transmitter. We had an input network, which was the Montauk Chair, that's what we called it. Mr. Cameron, sitting over there in the red shirt, was the psychic that sat in the Montauk Chair and fed information into the computer system. The computer system essentially processed the information and spit it out to the transmitter. We had two transmitters, drove one of two antennas. There was also a Delta T antenna and a 100 kilowatt noise amplifier. This was the basic outlay of the Montauk system.
While I may not believe all of this 100%, like every single fine detail, but there's a lot of things that make me go, you know what? MK Ultra was a thing, and the government destroyed a bunch of the documents from that. And there's a lot of things that I'm sure the government isn't telling us, and obviously all alleged, but I'm sure that there's stuff that they don't tell us. And that's why it makes me think like, okay, maybe, is it all really that far-fetched? I'm not saying that all of this is true or anything like that, but just the idea behind it, the idea behind doing human experiments and trying to figure out time travel and things of that nature. I mean, I really would not be surprised if this was, if the Montauk Project was an actual thing. And because if it's supposed to be a continuation of MK Ultra, I mean, they destroyed a bunch of documents from MK Ultra, so who's to say, I'm pretty sure I said this either at the beginning of this video or in part one, but who's to say that they just didn't learn their lesson, so to speak, from the first part of the experiment, I guess you can say, and now they were being a little more safe with how they were doing these experiments, how they were kind of keeping it hush-hush, things of that nature. But again, all alleged, not saying that any of this is fact. I just putting on my tinfoil hat here. Before we get into Preston Nichols' involvement with the Montauk Project, I did want to kind of give a little bit of a background on Preston Nichols himself, just because I think he's kind of an interesting dude. I mean, rest in peace, he's no longer with us, but I think he was very interesting. Even if he was the mad scientist type is what I call it, I still find him interesting. So let's go ahead and get into a little bit of the background behind Preston Nichols. So let's take it back to 1971, and this is where Preston Nichols had been working for a company called AIL, or Airborne Instruments Laboratory. I so badly want to pronounce laboratory as laboratory because of Dexter's Laboratory. Anyway, throughout his years, Preston would obtain a degree in electrical engineering and became a specialist in electromagnetic phenomena. So this next part, I want to read word for word from his book, and because some of this is a little much and a lot of technical terms, so I'm just going to read it directly from his book. But he said, I continued to research in my spare time and collaborated with different physics to test and monitor their various responses. In 1974, I noticed a peculiar phenomena that was common to all of the physics that I worked with. Every day, at the same hour, their minds would be jammed. They couldn't think effectively. Suspecting that the interference was caused by an electronic signal, I used my radio equipment and correlated what came on over the airwaves at the times the physics were non-functional. Whenever a 410 to 420 megahertz cycle appeared on the air, they were jammed. When the 410 to 420 cycle was off, the physics would open back up after about 20 minutes. It was obvious that this signal was greatly impeding the ability of the physics. I decided to trace this signal. Placing a modified TV antenna on the roof of my car, I grabbed a VHF receiver and set out looking for the source of it. I tracked it right to Montauk Point. It was coming directly from a red and white radar antenna on the Air Force Base, which is the red and white antenna that you see in all the pictures, although now I don't think it's actually red and white anymore. I think it's kind of faded by now, and nature kind of reclaimed a lot of the base. But anyway, let's keep going. At first, I thought this signal might have been generated accidentally. I checked around and found out that the base was still active. Unfortunately, security was tight and the guards wouldn't give any useful information. They said that the radar was for a project run by the FAA. I couldn't press the point beyond that. In fact, their statement didn't make a lot of sense. This was a World War II radar defense system known as SAGE radar. It was totally antiquated, and there is not any known reason why the FAA would need such a system. I didn't believe them, but couldn't help being intrigued. Unfortunately, I had hit a dead end. This was until 1984, when one of Preston Nichols' friends let him know that Montauk was now abandoned, so he should just go ahead and check it out. So, of course, Preston Nichols went ahead and took a look. The weird thing of how the base was abandoned was there were papers that were kind of scattered all over the place, and that's not how the military would normally leave a base. They would normally wipe everything and all of that. But yeah, he was finding documents all over the floor, and I actually have a story about this. Not about Montauk, but there's a video that I did many years ago. I think this is going back 5 or 6 years now, but about Greystone. And Greystone was located in my home state of New Jersey, but they actually demolished the building. And there may or may not have been a time in my younger years, this is going back, I don't know, 20 years now or something, where my now husband and I decided to take a little peek around the old Greystone, and it was the same thing. There were medical records scattered all over the place. There were pictures of patients scattered all over the place, and it looked like they had just abandoned it. And yeah, I thought that was kind of strange too, because I mean, these are people's medical records. And I mean, I know that we have HIPAA laws and stuff now, but I don't know, it was just kind of weird to see it all just kind of scattered all over the place. And this is all alleged, of course, but I mean, this was also a very long time ago. But anyway, so going back to Preston Nichols and the Montauk project and going on the base and just kind of looking around. So when he was looking around, he did see a lot of equipment that kind of he was interested in, and he wanted to see if he could take it home. And there, I'm going to insert the clip here, but there's a documentary or interview, whatever you want to call it, that they did with Preston Nichols, and they showed kind of all the equipment that he had in his house. It was just everywhere. So of course, Preston just really enjoyed this type of, I guess you can call it technology or whatever you really want to call it. But instead of just taking equipment while he was exploring the base, Preston Nichols did go ahead and go through the proper people or the proper channels, whatever you want to call it, to be able to get some of this equipment. You know, like, hey, it's not being used. Is there any way that I could take it? Because for whatever he wanted to use it for. I mean, even if it was just to have it in his house, because he really enjoyed this stuff. Now, even though Preston Nichols didn't just take the equipment and he asked if he could take some of the equipment, there was a lot of back and forth. And the reason why was because when it came to the equipment, some of the equipment, they weren't really sure who it belonged to at that point in time. Then Preston's contact told him to go ahead and talk to a man from Bayonne, New Jersey, who would be able to kind of help him retrieve some of the equipment that he was asking to take. This is where the story gets interesting. So this mysterious man from Bayonne gave Preston some kind of paperwork stating that he could take this equipment and that it didn't belong to anybody and that it was abandoned. But he also told Preston that the caretaker of Montauk Air Force Base would show him around, and his name was Mr. Anderson. When Preston made it to the base, Mr. Anderson told him he could take anything he wanted during his trip, but that he'd have to kick him out if he came back a second time. Preston brought a man named Brian with him who was a psychic. Brian had helped Preston with some of his research, and Preston and Brian had decided to go into two separate directions. I'm assuming to cover more ground in less time, and Preston had stumbled upon what seemed to be a homeless man. The man had been living at the abandoned base for a while, and he was talking about how there was an experiment that happened that was absolutely horrible, and he hadn't gotten over it himself. He also spoke about a beast that had appeared, and this is just a little tidbit, like a little side note, but when they talk about the beast, it reminds me of in Stranger Things. It reminds me of the Demogorgons and all of the stuff in the Upside Down and like Vecna and all of that. This man had also said that he knew Preston and that Preston had been part of the project himself. But Preston had no idea who this homeless person was. He ended up going back and finding Brian, and he asked him for a psychic reading because Brian had also felt something really weird on the base. Quote, his reading was strangely similar to what the homeless man had just told me. He spoke of irregular weather patterns, mind control, and a vicious beast. He mentioned animals being affected, crashing through windows. Mind control was a main focus of Brian's reading, end quote. To make things even weirder for Preston was a few weeks later, another mysterious man had barged into his lab that he had at home, and what he was saying was similar to that of Brian's psychic readings and the homeless man at Montauk. Because it was weird for two complete strangers to Preston to know who he was and that their stories had somehow lined up with one another, he decided to look into Montauk and what his actual involvement was. Preston would go into town and ask the locals questions about the area or any weird occurrences. 6 people had told him it snowed in the middle of August, but hurricane-like winds would come out of nowhere, and thunderstorms, lightning, and hail were considered unusual occurrences. Anyway, locals also talked about the animals acting weird and coming to town in masses, sometimes even crashing through windows. Preston did state that he believed that the big radar reflector on top of the tower that you see in all of the pictures was used to beam mood control functions. Even the chief of police had something odd to say. There were strange things that would happen all the time, but one of these would be crimes being committed in a specific 2-hour window, then there wouldn't be any crime. Was this all some kind of weather pattern control and mind control thing? I mean, anything is possible, but I'll let you be the judge of these claims. Something that Peter Moon stated in his commentary at this point in Preston's story was, quote, while it is indeed healthy to remain skeptical, it is equally healthy to keep an open mind, end quote. In November of 1984, a man by the name of Duncan Cameron, which in Peter Moon's commentary, he said he actually met Duncan as well, but he had a piece of audio equipment that he had asked Preston to help him with. Preston had brought up bringing Duncan to a location that may seem familiar to him. Well, to no surprise, Duncan knew more about Montauk than originally expected. He knew exactly where everything was, and when they had gone into the transmitter building... Oh, and I forgot to say this earlier. Remember Mr. Anderson, the caretaker of Montauk, and how he told Preston that he would have to kick him out if he came back a second time? Well, he also told Preston that he takes a break at 7 p.m. every night, which we all know what that's code for. Anyway, Duncan and Preston went into the transmitter building, and Duncan went into some kind of a weird trance. He kept repeating the same things over and over again. Eventually, they figured out through some memory unblocking techniques Preston used on Duncan that Duncan was sent to become friends with Preston, then to kill him and blow up his lab. Obviously, Duncan didn't do that since they figured out he was programmed by someone and had started working for Preston instead. In July of 1986, Preston Nichols decided to share information about Montauk to the USPA, the United States Psychotronics Association during a speech. After this, Preston decided to go to the federal government with this information. He had a contact who was a nephew of a senior senator from the Southwest, Senator Goldwater. The senator saw documents that Preston had collected from the base that had orders on it that was evidence that the base was still operating after it was supposedly decommissioned in 1969. The senator did visit the base to investigate himself, and even though he was a government official, the people guarding the base weren't fans of him coming to try and investigate. Eventually, the senator completed his investigation and found that he couldn't find any trace of any type of government funding to the base during the time that these experiments were happening. With all of these weird things happening to Preston and people recognizing him, something just didn't feel right. Almost as if he was living two different realities or two different timelines, so to speak. In 1989, at the one company he worked at, there was a room that was closed off and only a few people had clearance to go into this room. Then one day, it had to be cleaned out. So of course, Preston took this as his opportunity to go in there and kind of discover a few things, but he said that there were imprints where things once stood. So, I mean, like, shelves and stuff like that, or desks, whatever. And he did also say that he saw an elevator, but unfortunately, when he tried to get into the elevator, I guess some kind of alarm or something had gone off. So security came, and they already weren't very big fans of Preston and the questions that he was asking about the room. Out of nowhere, Band-Aids would appear on Preston's hands, and he had no idea where they were coming from. He started going to the company nurse and asking her if he had gotten the Band-Aid from her, and she would say there's no record of him going to her and asking for a Band-Aid. Well, he asked enough to alert security again, and they had come to Preston asking him, why are you asking all these questions and things like that. He knew that he needed to kind of calm it down a little bit with the questioning and the investigating, because it clearly seemed as though maybe somebody was kind of on to him at that point, or they were kind of worried about all the questions that he was asking. But that wasn't until he heard about Project Moonbeam. And apparently there was something that was high security within the basement of the company that he was working for, and he was able to somehow get through security. So, with Preston being able to get through security, he walked into a really nice office. And in that office, there was a nameplate that said, Preston B. Nichols, Assistant Project Director. As I'm sure most people would feel about this, but he knew that even though this was a big major discovery, he knew that he couldn't take any of the documentation that was at his desk or even just snoop around a lot or whatever, because he knew that this could also alert security, or this could be cause for concern if something was out of order or something was disheveled, and then everything just kind of comes crashing down. But while he was in this office, he decided to try and memorize as much as he could that was in his office. There were a few days that went by, and Preston didn't want to go down into this portion of the company that he worked for, or his assistant director office, but he didn't want to look suspicious, so he waited a few days before he went down there again. And when he got through security, they had stated that they had someone who wanted to speak with Preston. And they had asked him, what are you doing down here? What's going on? And he said that he was going to his office. Well, that's when they told him, you don't have an office down here. So he told them, no, that's the room where my office is. And when they opened it up, there was nothing in there that had any tie to Preston Nichols. They also threatened Preston and told him to never speak about what he saw there that day. It wasn't until 1990 that he had a breakthrough. He had been working with a Della T antenna, and this antenna is used to bend time, according to Preston. The more Preston would kind of tinker with all of these things, the more that his memories would come back, until finally it all came back to him due to this bending of time thing. In July of 1990, Preston had been laid off. All of his connections and friends also severed ties. Now, in the book, there is an editorial note regarding this whole situation from Peter Moon, and I wanted to read it from the actual book because Even though it's a lot, I could summarize it, but I really think that reading it would be better. So here goes nothing. When I met Preston Nichols, it was shortly after a huge layoff in the defense industry, and his job with AIL had been terminated. Around Long Island Psychotronics, it was no secret that he had worked for AIL. When it came to the book, however, he wanted no mention of it. There were several reasons for this, at least one of which is that he did not want to anger his former employers or create a security situation for himself. Personally, I had never thought of AIL before I met Preston. For all I knew, it was a company he made up in his head. I was soon, however, to be disabused of this idea, and only by rather strange reasons that naturally occurred in my own life. Not long after signing a formal agreement to write the Montauk project with Preston, I received a call due to some design work from Magnavox. Upon going to their building, I was shocked to see that it was adjacent to a rather huge campus for Airborne Instruments Laboratory, or AIL. Although it is not such a big deal, it was as if the company itself was being imprinted upon my consciousness as a portent of things to come. Not too long afterwards, I decided to join a writing club to sharpen up my writing skills and was directed to a lady named Charlene. She invited me to her house one evening where there would be a gathering of writers, all of whom were aspiring to some sort of literary success. To my surprise, bordering an alarm, there was a huge radio antenna on the house. As I was the first one at the gathering, Charlene directed me to her living room to wait, where I promptly noticed a certificate that prominently featured AIL. What was this, I wondered. Charlene explained that her husband worked for AIL. As she was also a little familiar with what I was working on, she suggested I wait until her husband got home, which would be around 11 o'clock. His name is Dick Knadel, and to my surprise, he knew Preston Nichols pretty well. In fact, he had worked with him, heard his stories about Montauk, and even visited Camp Hero in an attempt to investigate Preston's claims. The large antenna was a ham radio antenna. Dick, however, was not a supporter of Preston's claims. His main argument, however, was that Preston was not an engineer, but simply a technician. How could he possibly be qualified to participate in such a project? Preston soon explained to me that he actually did secure an engineering diploma from the University of Tampa, but it was given on the basis of a series of challenge exams where you established that you had the equivalent knowledge thereof. Preston had gone to school previously at Brooklyn Polytech, where he quit after being disgusted with his professor for stealing his work. Preston was and is a genius and has always been far ahead of his peers when it comes to technical matters. He said that he never let human resources know about his engineering diploma, as it was more advantageous for him to work as a tech due to the fact that he would receive generous overtime pay. Although Dick could not get on board with Preston's strange theories about the Montauk project, he did mention one rather remarkable oddity concerning Preston. He said that although AIL typically had a very strict dress code, it did not apply at all to Preston. In fact, he said it was as if Preston had no regard for the dress code whatsoever. This clearly indicates that Preston was considered extremely valuable. If he was a mundane technician, he would have been summarily fired for such. In this chapter, Preston also mentions a high security room at AIL, which appeared to have strange coil structures and was part of Project Moonbeam. At a book signing one evening, a man showed up who worked as a security guard at AIL. When he was told about this particular area and read about it in the book, he said he knew the exact location. Although he asked about it, he found out that it was indeed a high security area, and he knew better than to pursue it further. Although the project in this chapter is referred to as Project Moonbeam, that was not the original name. It was actually Project Moonstruck. Preston was adamant about not using the actual name in the book. When I asked him why, he said that he did not want to piss off Dick Knadel. He said that Dick was over him in the organizational structure of the Montauk project and that he led a secret life. Based upon my own conversations with Dick, I cannot verify Preston's claims. It is extremely coincidental, however, how all of these corroborative bits of experience landed in my lap, particularly when I was not looking for them. There was another bizarre coincidence, which was perhaps even more to the point. When I actually had completed the manuscript for this book and had the typesetting done, I looked for a local printer who could turn the book into a short order. When I finally found one that was willing to work on a fast turnaround, I visited the plant to meet the sales lady who promptly took me into the press room where there was a huge stacks of promotional material, all of which prominently displayed AIL, one of their primary clients. This was very weird. It demonstrated, however, that what I was dealing with was very close to home. Keep in mind, Long Island is 120 miles with millions of people and numerous printers and defense contractors. The pattern of coincidences being played out was more than odd. I eventually had the book printed in the Midwest as the prices were much more reasonable, even when one factored in the shipping. It is now over 25 years since the Montauk Project Experiments in Time hit the bookshelves. It is hard to convey how challenging it was to compile the information and publish the actual book. There was considerable mental opposition from others with regard to disseminating Preston's story, which was, after all, a controversial account of what he could muster up from repressed memories. It was like working in the shadow of Goliath or a great beast that everyone was denying the existence of, but were also afraid to admit that it might not only exist, but was influencing their lives. Something that I have heard spoken about so much, especially recently, is that of the government controlling the weather and chemtrails, all of that kind of stuff. This, even though I've seen it spoken about more now, it's nothing new. You can think that it's a weird conspiracy theory or you can believe it, whatever. That is your prerogative. You believe or don't believe whatever you want. But this theory is something that actually stems from Wilhelm Reich and the Phoenix Project, which later would absorb Project Rainbow. In the late 1940s is when the United States government started a weather control project, and both the information and technology came from an Austrian scientist by the name of Dr. Wilhelm Reich. Dr. Reich also studied with Sigmund Freud and Carl Jung. Preston Nichols describes Dr. Reich as extremely brilliant, but also controversial. Preston also stated that many of Dr. Reich's critics were not able to look at his findings and research, partially because the FDA supervised a massive book burning of all of his research and his laboratory. I know, this may seem kind of far-fetched, but is it really? Maybe controlling the weather is less believable for most, but the burning of information that the government doesn't want out there is a little bit more believable. At least to me it is. And while it may not have happened here, I would not be surprised if it's happened with other things that us non-government officials aren't supposed to know about. Anyway, Dr. Reich was known for his discovery of orgone energy, which is orgasmic or life energy. According to Preston Nichols, quote, his experiments revealed orgone energy to be distinctly different from ordinary electromagnetic energy. He was able to prove the existence of this energy in the laboratory. His findings were written up in various psychiatric and medical journals of the period. The discovery of a type of energy called orgone was not so controversial. It became very controversial with the powers that be when he reported curing cancer with his theories. He also associated orgone energy with cosmic energy and the Newtonian concept of the ether. None of these views won him support from conventional scientists of the 1940s. At the turn of the century, scientists had embraced the Newtonian ether. This referred to a hypothetical, invisible substance that was postulated to pervade all space and serve as a medium for light and radiant energy. Einstein, who embraced the theory in his early years, eventually determined that there could not be a calm ether through which matter moves. Not all physicists bought Einstein's argument, but Reich didn't disagree. He pointed out that Einstein disproved the concept of a static ether. Reich considered the ether to be wave-like in nature and not static at all. Something that Dr. Reich would go on to find in his studies is that violent storms accumulated dead orgone energy, and he started calling it DOR. Dr. Reich found that this DOR existed in not just violent storms, but in people and environments. So, an example of this would be an active and happy go-getter would have good orgone energy, while a complaining hypochondriac would have DOR. which I can see where he was coming from with something like this to a point. In the late 1940s, Dr. Reich contacted the government, and according to Preston Nichols, despite what we've heard, the government actually thought Dr. Reich was a brilliant man and asked to see his prototypes and things of the like. There were different devices that they used to collect data on the weather. Remember when I talked about the Philadelphia experiment just a little while ago? It's when the USS Eldridge disappeared and reappeared in a different spot, and then some crew members were fused to the ship while others had been so traumatized that they were considered mentally unfit. Okay, well, Project Rainbow, which, as I stated earlier, was absorbed by the Phoenix Project, and that was the code name for the operation. That was why the Philadelphia experiment even happened to begin with. Dr. John von Neumann, which I spoke about within the Philadelphia experiment portion of this video, but he had worked on the original Rainbow Project and then went on to work on something new, which was similar to that of the Rainbow Project, but their goal was to find out what went wrong with the Philadelphia experiment when it came to the people who were so horribly affected by it, and because that experiment was considered a massive failure. Dr. von Neumann was a mathematician who came to the United States from Germany. Dr. Neumann was born in Budapest in 1903, which back then was actually part of Austria. But back to Dr. Neumann and the Montauk Project part of this video. He became a theoretical physicist and was known for his advanced concepts of space and time. So this next portion, I want to read from Preston Nichols' book about Dr. von Neumann, and it says, as von Neumann began work on the Phoenix Project, he quickly learned that he was going to have to study metaphysics. He had to understand the metaphysical side of man. The rainbow technology had dissolved the physical and biological structure of human beings. People were stuck in bulkheads and changed beyond recognition in some cases. But it was the aristoric workings of the mind that had been affected first in each case. Von Neumann and his team spent about 10 years working out why human beings had troubles with electromagnetic fields that shifted them through different places and times. They actually found out that humans are born with what is known as a time reference point. At conception, an energy being is attached to a timeline, and we all start from that point. To understand this, it is necessary to view the energy being, or soul, as distinct from the physical body of the person concerned. Our whole reference as a physical and metaphysical being stems from that time reference, which actually resides within the electromagnetic background of our planet. This time reference is the basic orientation point you have to the universe and the way it operates. You can imagine how you would feel if the clock suddenly started moving backwards and time as well. It is this time reference point that was thrown out of the kilter with the individual crewmen of the USS Eldridge and caused them untold trauma. The Rainbow technology and the Phoenix Project, from my understanding on how Preston Nichols explained it, was they were trying to create an alternate reality of some sort. So if they were trying the Philadelphia experiment a second time, they could not only isolate the ship, but the human beings on it as well, so that they could survive and be coherent and aware of what is going on. Dr. von Neumann was also chosen because of his experience and knowledge with computers at the time. Something that gets brought up is there is the physical being and the spiritual being when it comes to humans. Preston Nichols said that the time reference in the computer would lock in the spirit and the electromagnetic background would lock in the body. The project started in 1948 and was finally developed in 1967. Once everything was all done, a report of all of the research and findings was sent to Congress. Well, in 1969, they were ordered to disband the entire project because Congress was too worried that if the wrong people were to get their hands on all of this information, they themselves could lose their minds and be controlled. If all of this is true, it truly doesn't surprise me. So let's learn how to control minds, but then shut down the program to do so because we don't want to be controlled. I can see why a lot of people believe these theories because while some of it is very outlandish and questionable, especially without proof, but some would actually make sense. I mean, the CIA did go through with MKUltra. When the Phoenix Project was shut down, the group that Preston Nichols calls the Brookhaven Group or Brookhaven National Labs, which seems to be in service in present day as well in 2025. But anyway, the group went to the military and told them about technology they were working on that could make an enemy surrender before any battle would start. Quote, the military became enthusiastic and were ready to cooperate. They were informed that they didn't need to get involved in the financing because that was covered by the group at Brookhaven National Labs. But the Brookhaven people needed a place where proper experimentation could be done in seclusion. They needed certain equipment and personnel from the military. They gave the military a list of all technology required, end quote. One of the things that they needed on that list was something called SAGE radar. Well, they were in luck. You might know what I'm about to say, but this is when the old decommissioned Montauk Air Force Base comes into the picture because they just so happen to have a SAGE radar system. Quote, the SAGE radar at Montauk was originally part of the early warning defense systems used during the 50s and 60s. Today, satellites and over-the-horizon radar make this technology obsolete for defense purposes. It certainly raises an important question. Even if one doesn't believe this story, why was an old antiquated defense system turned on and utilized for a period of over 10 years? End quote. In earlier parts of Preston's book, he actually shared copies of orders that showed the base was operating during this time period that they were supposedly shut down during. Now, the whole Montauk project that we know of in this conspiracy theory was actually called Phoenix 2, which makes sense because it's basically a sequel to Phoenix 1 since Congress shut them down. Preston stated that the financing for this project was kept very private, so he doesn't know who was funding it, but some sources told him that the original funding came from the Nazis. Preston Nichols stated that the theory of funding coming from the Nazis was, quote, in 1944, an American troop train went through a French tunnel carrying $10 billion worth of Nazi gold. This train was dynamited in the tunnel while carrying 51 GIs. General George Patton was in Europe at the time and investigated this, but he couldn't understand how an American train could be dynamited in Western Allied territory. As a general and human being, he cared about the GIs. The $10 billion was also a mystery, but Patton's efforts were blocked. I've been told this gold eventually showed up at Montauk and it was $10 billion of gold, then priced at $20 an ounce. This was the equivalent of almost $200 billion in today's currency, which, side note, this is present day in his quote, not in 2025. This was when the book was written. But anyway, it was used to finance the project initially and for years to come. After it was all spent, the project was allegedly financed by the infamous Krupp family, who controlled the ITT Corporation, end quote. According to Preston, the Krupps were owners of the German munitions factories for World War I and II. Once they were found guilty of war crimes and complicity with Hitler at the Nuremberg trials, the head of the Krupp family was paroled from a light prison sentence and allowed to continue their arms dealings. Now, that's just a simplified version. By late 1970, early 1971, the Montauk Air Force Base was coming back to life. And by late 1971, the Montauk Project had begun. Preston Nichols would be brought in to be part of the project in 1973. There were some Air Force technicians who worked on the SAGE radar in the 60s, and they told the Phoenix Project group that they could change the general mood of the base by changing the frequency and pulse duration of the radar. This is when the Phoenix group thought that changing the pulse rate and pulse width could change the general way that people were thinking. And I'm sure it's obvious by this point that if mind control was one of their goals, they had the exact information they needed from these technicians. With this information, the Phoenix group got to work and they started running some experiments. Preston Nichols called it the microwave oven experiments because what they did was take a reflector, which is one that can be seen from a distance at Montauk Point, and they rotated it and angled it down to point at a specific spot in one of the buildings. This building would be home to the Montauk Chair, which we will get into in a little bit, but this chair was in a shielded room. Duncan Cameron, which, if you remember, is supposedly Al Bielek's brother, but from a different timeline. but Duncan was the one that would be sitting in the chair, in the Montauk chair. While the antenna was focused on this building, the transmitter was blasting gigawatts of power. These experiments would use a transmitter, but change the different pulse rates and frequencies. Basically, what they were doing was trying to see if they could train or change brain waves. And even though the door was always closed to this shielded room with the chair, it didn't really work properly. In 1986, research showed that Duncan was brain dead. Even other psychics that did readings on Duncan said the same thing. Preston Nichols had asked a neurologist friend if it was possible that someone could be brain dead but still walking around, and he stated that yes, it was possible. Since Duncan was a psychic, that's what was keeping him alive and strong. Supposedly, the way that this worked was Duncan's psychic part of his mind took over the physical part, and that was what was keeping his body going. Well, by 1972 to 1973, they started seeing that this technology dealt with non-burning radiation. So what they decided to do was take the antenna and turn it 180 degrees and then aimed the burning rays into the sky and hit the person with the non-burning rays. That would be when they would see the mood-altering things in their human subjects. Since the base had a gym and a bowling alley and things of that nature, sometimes different military units were invited to come to the base for a little bit of R&R. And I mean, Montauk was in a beautiful location, so it would have been an invitation that no one would really bat an eye at. Basically, what I'm trying to say is it doesn't look like a scary place where they would, have experiments going on. But anyway, the military personnel that was invited had no idea that they were actually being used in an experiment with the mood-altering technology. Military personnel weren't the only ones being experimented on. Civilians who lived in Montauk, along with Long Island, New Jersey, upstate New York, and Connecticut were also tested on to see how far the technology could reach, but the soldiers were the ones who were a main focus. Now we move on to the Montauk Chair, and the Montauk Chair had a sensor technology that was developed in the 1950s. There is science behind it, of course, but the long story short is the technology was a mind-reading machine, and it was able to pick up electromagnetic functions of humans and then translate it either in digital form or on a screen. According to Preston Nichols, he stated that it's a mystery as to how this technology was developed, but it's believed that it was thanks to an alien race called the Syrians, who came from the star system Sirius, which, I mean, hearing about aliens isn't anything new. This is an ongoing debate on whether they exist or not. And my opinion on the matter is I truly do not believe that we are the only species out there. But do other beings look like the aliens we've seen everywhere, or do they look like E.T.? I can't comment on that because I've never seen one, but I don't think they necessarily have to look like that. But yeah, I can't believe that we're the only beings out there. Preston Nichols had joined the Montauk Chair project eventually when it was time to work with the radio frequencies and transmitter. He stated that they were experiencing issues with feedback, so they had to move the Montauk Chair. They ended up moving the chair to Southampton, Long Island. A psychic would sit in the chair, and then the information would be sent to the Montauk transmitter. The way Preston Nichols described it was that the psychic would have their thoughts, and then one of the computers would decode what they were thinking. It took a few years to work on the technology to get it better, but then they had run into a problem in about 1979. Quote, "If there was a glitch in the flow of time in our reality, everything fell apart. In other words, if the psychic in the chair projected a reality in terms of time in this case that was not consistent with our reality, the flow of time in our reality, it would cause the connection between Southampton and Montauk to break up. Any glitch in space and time between the two cities would cause the transmission of the thought form to cease. To better understand a time glitch, imagine time as a continuous pulsation or flow. As the basic pulsation of time interacts and changes form with other flows or phenomena, We have motion as we know it, against the backdrop of time, when these core pulsations that make up time are shifted due to a reality change or other phenomena. The direction, speed, or flow of the time is changed. This is what is known as the time glitch. Theoretically, these occur every now and then, and since we are referenced in our reality, we really don't notice a time glitch. Deja vu phenomena could well be an example of a glitch in the fabric of time, end quote. In order to reduce these interferences and time glitches with the Montauk Chair, they needed to bring the Montauk Chair back to Montauk. However, at the same time, they needed to change a few things in order for the chair to not be affected by Montauk's electromagnetic fields. What they found was working was a coil structure in the receivers that was designed by Nikola Tesla. They also needed to replicate what crystal receivers did with the Syrian technology, and I mean actual crystals and the Syrians as in the aliens. But notice how Nikola Tesla and the aliens and stuff get brought up in Preston Nichols' story, just like Bielek's. But anyway, basically from my understanding, they needed materials like the crystal receivers and the technology of Nikola Tesla for the coil structure. Eventually, the chair was up and running on Montauk grounds, and it was actually underground in the basement of the transmitter building in a shielded room. I know I've spoken about Duncan Cameron quite a number of times so far throughout this entire video, and he was actually able to start making objects appear almost out of thin air. This all started happening in 1977 when the transmitter was finally working with no glitches, and they wanted to see how far they could take this. Well, Duncan would start concentrating on a solid object and it would just appear on the base. Even with making these objects appear, sometimes it would only be visible to you, but you wouldn't be able to actually touch it or hold it. And then other times it would be stable enough to stay and was a real object that you could touch. Sometimes these objects would only stick around if the transmitter was turned on. There was another experiment that they had Duncan test out, and that was the seeing eye experiment. This is where he would have a lock of someone's hair or something that belonged to a person, and he would concentrate on said person. He would do this to try and see through their eyes, hear through their ears, and feel through their body. According to Preston Nichols, this experiment was successful, but he had no idea how extensive it was. Now, if this is something that happened or if this is something that people can do in the future, it's actually really invasive and really concerning. It's one thing to control people's minds, which again is not right, but taking over their bodies too is just pure insanity. The next step was to see if Duncan can control how these people were thinking, and he would do this by meeting a person, and then he would concentrate on this person so much that he would get into their mind and control what they were saying. Remember how in the beginning of the video I talked about the people of Montauk and them saying that animals were acting weird, or the police having to deal with crime within only a certain window of time? Apparently that was done with this type of experimentation with Duncan. You might be wondering, how could Duncan Cameron perform all of these experiments and not feel weird about it or not feel as though it was unethical to be doing these types of things? Well, here's the reason for it. Quote, "One must realize that when Duncan did these experiments, he was in an altered form of consciousness. He had been given special training, which could possibly have been administered by the CIA or NSA. In any event, his conscious mind would be diverted through sexual bliss. What could be termed the primitive mind would then surface. Duncan, the individual, would be transferred into an orgasmic trance. His primitive mind, at the disposal of the researchers, became very suggestible and therefore controllable. For this programming, information could be installed via any of the body's senses. Duncan would then be directed to have his primitive mind concentrate on the information thus installed." End quote. By 1978, all of these mind control techniques were completely developed and recorded, and the records would be given to different agencies to see where they would go from there. By 1979, after continuing the experiments, Duncan was able to time warp and bend time. An example that was shared was Duncan would concentrate on something at 8 p.m. and then the object or event would happen hours later at midnight or even the following morning at 6 a.m. Of course, the people involved were excited to know that Duncan could bend time. They had to start going to conferences in Olympia, Washington called Sigma conferences to learn more about time bending and time manipulation. At these conferences, they discovered that they needed to work on some more of their technology and parts of the coil. Well, this is when they would introduce another antenna that Preston referred to as the Orion Delta T antenna. The reason why it's referred to as Orion is because there was a rumor that the design was given to project by aliens from the Orion constellation, and these aliens were different from that of the Sirians I spoke about in a different part of this video. Quote, "The Orion Delta T was a huge antenna, and it was placed underground. The height was about 100 to 150 feet from point to point. Excavations were completed to about 300 feet to house the antenna under the transmitter. The Montauk Chair was placed under the transmitter and above the Delta T antenna. This was done in order to phase the above-ground RF antenna with the below-ground loop antenna so that the chair was in a null point between them. The null point was meant to cut off the interference even deeper. It knocked the interference right out of the chair completely." End quote. Eventually, they found a way to actually open portals. Duncan would concentrate on an opening in time, so for example, from 1980 to 1990, and there would be a portal that would be open in the middle of the Delta T antenna. It's been said that you could walk through it and it would remain open for as long as Duncan stayed concentrated on that time period. Preston Nichols never experienced walking through due to him being considered too valuable of a technician to travel through the portal. He stated that people would describe the portals to him, and that's how he knows that people did in fact walk through them. But once they had figured out how to stabilize this whole walking through time warps and portals thing, they kicked everyone out and cleared the entire base except for a few people. Preston Nichols was one of them that stayed along with Duncan Cameron, two other psychics in case something happened to Duncan, project directors, but the military left. A new team was brought in to maintain the base, but everything was super tight with security. A new technical crew was also brought in. This crew was called the Secret Crew. Real creative, I know, but that's what they were referred to as in the book. Then the project was relaunched as Phoenix 3, and this lasted from February 1981 to 1983. They were able to test things that were on the other side of the portal without ever entering it, which I'm sure was a little less unnerving for some people. And the reason why some of this could be unnerving for some people is because they did have people who would get lost within the vortex of these portals, and it was due to a glitch in the hyperspace. They did lose a lot of people, but they kept running these experiments. Something that Preston claims in his book was that they would sometimes grab people off the street, such as addicts, alcoholics, and basically people that they deemed wouldn't have a huge search party out for them, and this was so that they could do more of these experiments, and most of these people didn't make it back. This entire Montauk project can be one big elaborate fiction story, but if it's true, or if parts of it are true, such as pulling people off the streets for experiments, I would be completely saddened, but also not surprised. What is even more upsetting is, in addition to these people being used, they also use children. There was one child at Montauk who would go out and bring other kids to Montauk. The kids they chose were between 10 and 16 or maybe even 18. They usually fit the Aryan stereotype, so blonde hair, blue eyes, tall, light-skinned boys, and no girls in the group. At first I thought Preston Nichols was going to talk about the Montauk boys, which is something that unfortunately I couldn't find a lot of information on. There was an interview that I found online, but other than that, there really wasn't a lot. But from the general gist that I got about the Montauk boys was that they took a bunch of these boys and they did the whole mind control experiment on them, and then these boys went out into the world and did what they asked them to do. But that's not what Preston Nichols was talking about at this point in the book. Quote, a later investigation showed that Montauk had a neo-Nazi connection and that the Nazis were still on the Aryan kick. We don't know where the kids went, what they were educated in or programmed for. Whether they came back or not is still a mystery. What information is available is that they sent every raw recruit into the future to 6037 AD, always to the same point, to what appeared to be a dead city in ruins. Everything was stationary, not unlike a dream state. There were no signs of life. In the center of the city was a square with a gold horse on a pedestal. There were inscriptions on that pedestal, and recruits were sent there to read what they said. Each recruit would interpret and report. We still don't know what the researchers were after, end quote. Preston claims that there were a lot of people, anywhere from 3,000 to 10,000 people that were shoved somewhere into the future, maybe 200 or 300 years ahead. On August 5th, 1983, the team was given an order to run the transmitter nonstop. Everything was pretty normal until August 12th, where all of a sudden the equipment somehow synced up with that of the USS Eldridge, and this was done through a portal. Supposedly, 1943 Duncan Cameron, that was actually aboard the USS Eldridge, appeared. Preston Nichols stated they kept the 1983 Duncan from seeing his 1943 version so that there weren't any effects of seeing one another that would alter whatever tests and experiments they were running. Preston Nichols stated that him and some of his co-workers were getting a little nervous about all these experiments and they decided to have a fail-safe, basically. They somehow figured out a way Duncan would crash the entire project in case something went wrong. The phrase they decided to use for this was, quote, the time is now, end quote. So one day, someone went to Duncan and told him those 4 words because the team had decided, well, the time was now. Once this was said, Duncan had released a monster from his subconscious. This monster had been released on the base and not in the underground basement they had been running all of these tests. The monster was big, hairy, and hungry, along with being about 9 to 10 feet tall. Some said it was 30 feet tall, but I'm sure any type of monster or weird animal can feel like 30 feet tall. Preston's supervisor told him and the team to shut off the generators so that they could get these monster beast things away from everyone, and it would just disappear back into its own world or own dimension, whatever. As you can imagine, this didn't work. Well, their next idea was to shut off the transmitter. They also had to send somebody back to turn off the transmitters on the Eldridge. This was because turning off the transmitter at Montauk also didn't work. Well, at least not right away. Eventually, they were able to shut off the transmitter after many attempts of cutting power, then cutting wires. The whole 9. The beast went back to where it came from, and the portal closed. This part of the book reminds me of the part in Stranger Things where the Upside Down was seeping out and 11 had to use all of her power to close the opening. After what happened on August 12th, 1983, Montauk was emptied. The power was restored and the lights were left on, but everything was a mess. According to Preston Nichols, quote, most of the personnel were eventually rounded up, debriefed, and brainwashed accordingly, end quote. So what happened to Montauk? Preston Nichols said that in addition to all of the stuff I just went over in the last part, in May or June of 1984, the military was actually sent to the base and ordered to kill anything that moved because they wanted to get rid of anything or anyone that was still on the base. After that, another group of people would be brought in to take all of the equipment and all of the sensitive documentation off of the base. I'm not sure why they waited so long to collect all of this information from the time of the beast and the whole the time is now thing. I'm not sure why they waited so long because I feel as though people, they explore abandoned buildings and stuff all the time. So, I mean, unless if there was just really, really high security there and nobody really wanted to go in there. I don't know, but I feel like they did wait a little long to get rid of sensitive information or documentation equipment and all of that. 6 months after all of that, there would be a bunch of cement mixing trucks that would come on the base and they would fill all of the underground areas, and after that the gates were closed and Montauk Air Force Base was abandoned. Well, we have officially come to the end of this series, and I'm sure that some of this sounded a little out there and a little tinfoil hat-ish, I guess you could say, whereas maybe some of it actually did make sense. And I mean, researching this, it was really interesting for me to research. I do welcome any corrections or anything that anybody wants to add to it, but I don't think we'll ever find out the truth behind the Montauk Project. I don't think that the government, if this was something that actually happened, I don't think that we'll ever know the truth, especially because Preston is no longer with us, and all we have are just some personal accounts of what happened. And could this be some kind of sci-fi story? Sure, it could be. I mean, this is, if it is, this is the works of a brilliant mind and a very creative mind, in my opinion. But I mean, that can also be the case as well. It doesn't necessarily mean that all of this is true or not true or whatever. I mean, you can believe whatever you want. I don't really know what to believe. I believe that the government doesn't tell us things, and I believe that there are things, unethical things, that allegedly happen behind the scenes that we don't know about and that we will never know about. So who's to say that some, if not all, of the stuff that I talked about in this series is true or false? I mean, I really don't know. So it's kind of a toss-up, and you can let me know what you think of all of this. I hope that you enjoyed this series. I know that this was kind of all over the place, but I'm going to be really honest with all of you. I had so much fun researching this video, and I haven't felt this excited about a topic on my channel in a long time, because don't get me wrong, I love making all the videos that I make on my channel, but this was probably one of my favorite topics to cover in a few years. I did also just want to say I apologize for being gone for so many months. This series actually took a long time for me to research and put together and find the time to film and all of that. But on top of that, there were a lot of things that were happening behind the scenes. I actually, over the summer, ended up going to the dentist and getting my first ever fillings done. And not like many of you probably care about this, but the dentist messed up. And they actually created some nerve damage in my teeth because they did the fillings incorrectly. So I had to have all 4 of my wisdom teeth pulled. So I was dealing with a lot of pain all summer in my mouth. And so then I had my teeth pulled. And then after I got my teeth pulled, we had family in town. And it has just been a crazy couple of months. So that's kind of what's been going on. It's been a lot. So I just want to let everybody know I'm so sorry about that. And I'll stop rambling. Thank you so much for watching. And this is Monica reporting to you live from a highway. Bye.